Test. Push it or? Test. Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay.
the fraud side, we'll have a lot more resources to figure out how it is that we can pay for these things to make these systems work better. And so the reason that we're here today is to strengthen one of the most important federal programs, that's Medicare, that obviously provides necessary healthcare services to millions of our nation's seniors. Every year, Medicare loses billions of dollars through fraud and improper payments, and today we're going to find out what the administration is doing to stop that. When we first constituted this subcommittee at the beginning of the Congress, the ranking member and I talked about our shared goal of working together, establishing facts, and making government work better for all Americans. And today I have the unique privilege of chairing a hearing on this topic that I know my friend Mr. Lewis has worked on for many years, including holding hearings and producing legislation as the chairman of this very same subcommittee. He's detained. I think the Democratic caucus is meeting right now, and I would ask for unanimous consent for him to have leave to give his opening statement upon his arrival. I know I'm speaking for every member on this committee when I say that we're extremely concerned about Medicare fraud. It remains a serious and evolving threat, and there are billions of dollars at stake. And there continues to be a lot more work to be done to get ahead of the criminals and to get it under control. So today's hearing is a continuation of the significant work that these members in Congress have done in the past, and we're going to be taking a look at what the administration's current effort is in ways that we can improve Medicare payment integrity. To begin with, I just want to pause and emphasize just how big of a problem this is. Last year, the federal government lost $124.7 billion in improper payments across 124 programs. Of that $124 billion, one program accounted for $60 billion or so, and that was Medicare. Because the program is so large and susceptible to abuse, the Government Accountability Office has singled it out as a high risk for fraud every year since they started keeping track in 1990. Historically, CMS has used a method of payment called pay and chase in processing Medicare payments, first paying a charge, then later looking back to check in the validity and potentially trying to claw back the money if the payment was made improperly. As you can imagine, that strategy isn't very effective. Time and again, we've seen fraudsters hustle the system for a few $1 million, shut down, pop up under a new name, and run their scam somewhere else. The Medicare program is getting outsmarted by these methods, and the proof is the unacceptably high rate of improper payments each year. In 2010, I proposed a new approach to help CMS work smarter. Instead of pay and chase, CMS should use the same kind of cutting-edge predictive analytics technology that private companies use successfully to look at transaction data in real time and identify potentially fraudulent charges, stopping the payment before the money goes out the door. Credit card companies use a similar system to identify a potentially fraudulent charge and stop payment while they further investigate the claim. And the framework for that idea was later enacted as part of the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010. The system created by CMS to incorporate data analytics to protect Medicare is called the Fraud Prevention System, or FPS. In its first year, FPS got off to a rocky start. Health and Human Services Inspector General couldn't even certify any of the system's results. In its second year, ending in July 2013, the IG certified that the system had returned $1.34 for each dollar invested that year, totaling $54.2 million in savings. Now, $54.2 million is significant money, but it is literally a drop in the bucket when compared to the $60 billion lost that I referenced earlier. And as it currently operates, FPS is catching less than 1% of improper payments. And I should add, CMS is still primarily relying on the pay and chase model to go back after money that has already been paid out improperly, rather than stopping improper payments on the front end. I continue to think that the idea behind FPS is sound, but taxpayers are entitled to see the idea implemented with excellence. Each dollar we fail to secure from fraud and improper payments is a dollar that isn't going into needed health care services for our seniors. And when we look around at what private companies are doing to protect the integrity of their transactions, it's clear that so far, FPS is leaving a lot on the table. For the first panel, this subcommittee wants to hear directly from CMS and the Office of the Inspector General about how they're using FPS and other data sources to identify emerging trends in Medicare fraud. We want to know how CMS and OIG are coordinating their efforts with the Department of Justice to share data and to prosecute Medicare fraudsters. And I'll note here that regrettably, we invited the Department of Justice to testify about these issues today, but they were unable to provide a witness. On the second panel, we'll hear from two witnesses who previously served in the administration at DOJ and CMS, respectively, and we'll get their insights about how the government is performing on these issues. And then another witness will tell us about how CMS and DOJ are collaborating with the private sector to address fraud issues affecting both Medicare and private insurers. And finally, we'll hear about how Visa, a private sector company, has used predictive analysis to stop fraud. Visa's global rate of fraud is 6 basis points, meaning 99.4% of the $10 trillion in payments it processes are fraud-free. That's an impressive track record, and we hope to learn a thing or two from Visa. We look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses and thank them for their time and their willingness to come today. Now, as I said, Mr. Lewis is detained. He will be here shortly, and when he comes, I will invite him to make his opening statement. And in the interim, why don't we start out? We'll hear from our two government witnesses on the first panel, Dr. Shantanu Argawal, from Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and Gary Cantrell from the Office of Inspector General for Health and Human Services. Gentlemen, thank you for your time today. We've already received your written testimony, and you have 5 minutes. Doctor, if you'd like to go ahead, you're welcome.
Sure, thank you. Chairman Roscom, Mr. Doggett, other members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to discuss the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services' use of data in its program integrity efforts. Mr. Chairman, we appreciate your leadership on these issues and your ongoing interest in making sure CMS has the tools and resources necessary to best use data to fight fraud in Medicare. Enhancing program integrity is a top priority for this administration and an agency-wide effort at CMS. Since passage of the Affordable Care Act and other critical legislation, CMS's Center for Program Integrity has become increasingly data-oriented, using data in a variety of ways to inform our efforts to identify waste, abuse, and fraud. CMS is using a number of tools, including innovative data analytics, to keep bad actors out of our programs and to uncover vulnerabilities, schemes, and trends quickly before they drain valuable resources from our trust funds. We have seen important successes from these efforts, and today I would like to highlight two critical ways we use data to identify and prevent waste, fraud, and abuse: the fraud prevention system and our provider screening processes. Through both of these efforts, CMS is using data to stop issues on the front end and make important strides toward prevention. Since 2011, CMS has been using its fraud prevention system to apply advanced analytics on all Medicare fee-for-service claims on a streaming national basis by using predictive algorithms and other sophisticated analytics to analyze every Medicare fee-for-service claim against billing patterns. The system also incorporates other data sources, importantly, including information on compromised Medicare cards and complaints made through 1-800-MEDICARE. When FPS models identify egregious, suspect, or aberrant activity, the system automatically generates and prioritizes leads for review and investigation by CMS's Zone Program Integrity Contractors, or ZPICs. CMS can use this information to swiftly take actions and stop problematic behaviors. The FPS has demonstrated an impressive return on investment of 5 to 1. In its second year of operation, the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General certified CMS's identified savings of more than $210 million in improper Medicare fee-for-service payments, double the previous year. These savings are the outcomes of activities such as revocations of provider billing privileges, the implementation of payment edits, the suspension of payments, and changes in behavior that result from CMS actions. In addition to saving taxpayer dollars through FPS, CMS has significantly strengthened provider enrollment. CMS now uses a risk-based approach to verify the legitimacy of new or existing Medicare providers by screening those that pose the highest risk to the program, including newly enrolling home health agencies and durable medical equipment companies. A combination of routine data checks of licensure and criminal records, scheduled and unscheduled site visits, and if anybody's wondering, the unscheduled visits work better, And fingerprinting is used to confirm the validity of providers and suppliers. CMS routinely revokes billing privileges from enrolled providers and suppliers based on the Social Security Administration's complete death master file and CMS's repository of information contained in the OIG's exclusion list, the Medicare exclusion database. As a result, we have removed nearly 500,000 Medicare enrollments, which stops these providers from billing the program and denied thousands of enrollment applications, which means these providers never gain the ability to bill the Medicare program. In the coming months, we will continue our work to transition as many of these data checks into a largely automated process, which improves the efficiency of provider screening while lowering burden on legitimate actors. While data is a critical part of our work, Medicare fraud, waste, and abuse will not be stopped with data alone. The true power of data analytics comes from using results to guide human interventions. Data helps CMS generate leads and take appropriate administrative actions. Medicare fraud, waste, and abuse affects every American by draining critical resources from taxpayers and our healthcare system. Our healthcare system should offer the highest quality and most appropriate care possible to ensure the well-being of individuals and populations. CMS is committed to protecting taxpayer dollars by preventing or recovering payments for wasteful, abusive, or fraudulent services. But the importance of program integrity extends far beyond dollars and healthcare costs alone. It is fundamentally about protecting our beneficiaries and ensuring we have the resources to provide for their care. Although we have made significant progress in stopping fraud and improper payments, more work remains to be done. I look forward to working with you and the Congress to fully utilize our data analytics systems to protect the integrity of our healthcare programs and safeguard taxpayer resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Cantrell?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and other distinguished members of the committee. I'm Gary Cantrell, Deputy IG for Investigations at OIG. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about OIG's efforts to fight fraud, waste, and abuse in Medicare. OIG utilizes a range of tools in this fight, including audits, evaluations, investigations, enforcement authorities, and educational outreach. Combining data analytics with field intelligence, we identify areas most vulnerable to fraud and deploy our resources to ensure the greatest impact from our work. OIG works closely with the Department of Justice, CMS, and other federal and state law enforcement partners to bring those who commit fraud against our programs to justice. Our Medicare Fraud Strike Force teams, located in 9 cities throughout the country, exemplify this approach. The OIG and our partners are committed to fighting and preventing fraud, waste, and abuse. Our efforts have produced some impressive results. In 2014, our work resulted in record numbers of criminal convictions, civil actions, and program exclusions. And since 1997, we've recovered more than $27 billion for the trust fund. Our return on investment is $7.70 for every dollar spent. Perhaps even more important, we're seeing strong indicators of a deterrent effect. When we work together to shed light on a program vulnerability, put criminals behind bars, and take appropriate administrative actions, we have the greatest impact. And our analysis reveals significant declines in Medicare payments across several program areas and strike force cities where we focused our efforts. For example, following federal enforcement and oversight activities, there have been sustained declines in Medicare payments for durable medical equipment, home health, ambulance, and community mental health centers, or CMHCs. Nationwide Medicare payments for CMHCs have decreased approximately $250 million annually. And total Medicare payments for ambulance services in Houston are down approximately 40%. Miami area DME payments have decreased by approximately $100 million annually since the launch of the strike force. And since 2010, home health payments have decreased nationally more than $1 billion annually. Despite these successes, more needs to be done. Fraud schemes are constantly evolving and migrating, and some of OIG's top oversight priorities include the rise in prescription drug fraud and schemes involving home-based care. It is also critical that we protect beneficiaries from harm that related to these healthcare fraud schemes. Rarely are these schemes perpetrated by one provider operating independently. There's often a network of individuals, including business owners, patient recruiters, healthcare practitioners, and sometimes even the patient. Kickbacks in the form of cash or drugs often bind these networks together. Identity theft is a national problem, and the theft of patient and provider data underpins many of our cases. Removing Social Security numbers from the Medicare card could also protect patient data and disrupt fraud schemes. Annual Medicare spending is approaching $600 billion. An estimated 10,000 individuals become newly eligible for Medicare every day. And Medicare prescription drug spending alone is projected to rise by $100 billion over the next 10 years. As the program continues to grow and evolve, the need to protect the Medicare program and the beneficiaries it serves from fraud has never been more important. OIG, working with our partners, will continue using data analytics to target our resources for maximum results. And full funding of the 2016 budget for OIG would enable us to continue our vigorous oversight efforts and further protect programs, beneficiaries, and taxpayers. We would like to express our appreciation for Congress's sustained commitment and support for our mission, and appreciate the committee's interest in this vital issue of protecting the Medicare program from fraud. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cantrell. Mr. Marchant is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thanks for being here today. If I could take you to a town hall meeting in my district, there's always going to be someone that stands up, usually in their upper 60s or 70s, and their question is, when are you going to stop waste, fraud, and abuse? And then they tell a story about someone they know, or some doctor that they know, or some story that they saw on the front page of the newspaper, or the lead-in for the last night's news story. So it's pretty confusing for the folks back home. They don't quite understand why their trust fund is being drained. They don't understand why the government, as big as it is, and as many billions of dollars are being spent, that there doesn't seem to be any more progress made. FPS, ZPIC, HCFAC, RAC, CDAC, CPI, all these are terms that we can throw out, but they really are basically meaningless to the people that we represent. So my question is, in plain English, what could I say back to them directly? Both of you have given excellent testimony today about at a technical level of what's happening. But when you read the statistics, the amount of fraud is actually going up, and the amount, I think last year it went from $60 billion in improper payments up about $16 billion. That's a 8.5% to 13% increase. So what can I say to them about what's really happening, and why can I tell them that we are making very concrete progress? Mr. Agrawal.
Sure, thank you for the question. And I can tell you, having taken care, I'm an emergency medicine physician, having taken care of literally thousands of Medicare beneficiaries myself, I know how involved they are in the program and how much they care about its longevity. I would answer this way, although I would like to come back a little bit later if it's possible, and really talk about the differences between improper payments and fraud. But to answer your question about how you discuss this with beneficiaries, I think there's a few important messages. One, we've got a lot of tools at our disposal in order to go after all manner of waste, abuse, and fraud. I highlighted a couple of tools in my opening statement between advanced analytic systems like the FPS, very importantly our provider enrollment systems, which make sure that providers and suppliers have they meet all the requirements to interact with those beneficiaries, from licensure to having legitimate sites of operation. These two things are incredibly important operating together. But we have additional resources and approaches to rooting out these issues. We conduct prior authorization and other prepayment reviews. Just last year, we stopped the payment of over $5 billion from prepayment medical review. That stops the dollars from going out the door in the first place. We have competitive bidding. And I think a second important, so there are a lot of tools that we utilize that should be emphasized, and we need to continue to build them. It is not a process that is done. I think secondly, I'd say get involved. As I mentioned earlier, Medicare beneficiaries love the program. They want it to last and be well funded. And what we see is that when beneficiaries are involved, they can be very helpful and important sources of information and leads. We get 40,000 complaints on average from Medicare beneficiaries every year related to program integrity. And we integrate those complaints into our existing analytics systems and models. Those complaints inform our investigations, and quite a few of them lead to real results. So their involvement is critical, and I would ask for them to continue to remain involved.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll echo what he was just saying about the beneficiaries, the Medicare patients being involved in this. We know that they care about the program. We want to get tips from them. If they suspect fraud, we want them to call us, 1-800-HHS-TIPS. There is a great deal of information they can provide to us to know what's happening on the ground. We work very closely with the senior Medicare patrols throughout the country, giving presentations to seniors in order to identify and report suspected fraud. So that's first, I think is critical that they get involved. Second, part of my job is getting bad actors out of the program. And so we have excluded over 4,000 individuals and entities from participation in Medicare program just this last year. And every year, around 3,000 people are removed from the program ineligible to participate after our exclusion authority. So our job is certainly, we continue to focus our efforts on getting bad actors out of the program. I am very much encouraged by the developments at CMS to have a provider screening process that keeps bad actors out of the program in the beginning. That's one of the most effective ways we can avoid some of these problems. Keep the bad people out of the program to start with. Don't let them bill us. So we support all the preventive efforts that are taking place at CMS. We want to work with them to improve those efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Meehan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this very, very important hearing, and thank you for the work that you do. The focus, saving these dollars, is so critically important so that we can direct them to the actual care. Dr. Agarwal, you used the word to make the difference between improper payments and fraud. What's the difference there?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's a very important question. Every year we're required in the Medicare and Medicaid programs to measure an improper payment rate. We do that based on a series of audits. And every year we publish that rate so that it's transparent to the public. I think what it's important to realize is that the drivers of the improper payment rate are not the same as the drivers of fraud. 60% of the improper payment rate is due to documentation issues. That means that there's insufficient documentation in the medical record to justify the service that was delivered. Now, fraud is not something that every provider or physician commits. In fact, just a small minority do. But I can tell you, being a physician, that documentation issues are something that even the most legitimate, well-meaning provider can commit.
But by its very nature, you're going to see patterns develop with fraud where the improper documentation should not be developing patterns.
Our experience is a little bit to the contrary, which is that when you're a fraudster and legitimate patient care is not your priority, you're not spending the majority of your day at the bedside trying to take care of Medicare beneficiaries, you have plenty of time to document very effectively.
So actually they're doing a better job.
They can do quite well, and we see standardized notes, other template-driven notes that actually would pass a number of different checks looking at the medical record. It's the legitimate providers, the ones that are spending the majority of their time at the bedside.
Well, then it opens up the door, too. It opens up to the door, and Mr. Cantrell, please jump into this as well, which is the investigations and the use of predictive analysis is really moving the ball forward. I had the good fortune of serving as a United States Attorney with one of the healthcare task forces that were set up, and it was a great step forward. But one of the other things that I really appreciated was it's one thing to take somebody out of qualification for a system. It's another thing to send them to federal prison. And that is the kind of thing that really gets people's attention. What is being done to find the right balance with the OIG and with the resources that you have, and in collaboration with other, particularly law enforcement resources, to take some of these 40,000 leads that you get and direct them to places where there can be criminal investigations and people can be held accountable, not so they just repurpose themselves and come back again in a different format, but they do a little time in Leavenworth.
Yeah, I'll say we're working very closely with law enforcement partners across federal and state and local law enforcement. We have the Medicaid fraud control units that exist in every state. We work very closely with them. We're working more than ever with the DEA because of the prescription drug abuse problem and the fraud problem that exists there. So there are opportunities for us to share this information between the FBI, the DEA, the OIG, and other law enforcement partners so that we're focusing our resources in the right areas.
How is that being done so that there's a regular collaboration, coordination? Because my experience is oftentimes, it's not a bad thing, but a lot of these things are housed in the civil division. And so you're getting a lot of work that's done. And oftentimes people are proud of the work that they've done. And even within the institution, people are proprietary. They want to protect the investigation. They don't want the crim guys getting involved in my work. What are you doing to assure that there's real effort to look at the most effective way? And let me ask the extent to which either of you are engaging in grand jury investigations, using the potential resources to break those schemes that you identified. Oftentimes, they're parts, larger parts of roles. Well, we have people that susceptible to grand jury subpoenas that are part of those networks, drug dealer or whomever. How much effort's being put into really getting away from predictive analysis and really tying it effectively with law enforcement resources?
The key is turning data into action. So we have lots of identification of suspect providers. It's turning that information into an investigation, gathering the evidence necessary for prosecution. We absolutely utilize grand juries. We work with our partners, and the information sharing on any particular investigation happens daily throughout the country.
What do you do to make sure that it is happening to make it actually do a good job? Dr. Agrawal, just the numbers indicate you're just starting on your efforts, not the same history or longevity. So there's a recognition, but at the same time, the numbers are more compelling in the form of impact in terms of predictive analysis turning into recoveries. What are you doing to make more timely referrals so from the outset you're working with law enforcement on your side?
I think that's a great question. So you're absolutely right that the authorities that CMS has now are unique in its history. The administrative authorities to stop payments on the front end, suspend anywhere from claim at a time to 100% of all the payments that a provider gets. And we have been working diligently to build those authorities, utilize them efficiently and effectively, because I think what we see what we've been focusing on is let's stop the flow of dollars for bad actors, and then absolutely work with law enforcement to take other steps in the criminal justice system, and if possible, put them in jail. We rely obviously very strongly on law enforcement to pick the ball up at that transition point where we can't go past administrative action. I think that partnership is definitely critical as long as we're also stopping that flow of dollars on the front end so that they're not taking advantage of the trust funds. And while I agree that figures of folks entering jail is really important, I would highlight the importance of 500,000 enrollments that are no longer able to build a program. And literally hundreds, if not thousands, of enrollment applications that are denied. These folks will never get a chance to send a claim. That is as preventive as it gets.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Noem is recognized.
Dr. Pay and Chase doesn't work very well, does it?
I agree. I think there are lots of tools that we should use, balancing both prevention and recovery.
My understanding is that using FPS, that is supposed to help CMS identify claims before they are paid out, fraudulent claims. Is that correct?
Yeah, the system has lots of different capabilities. So on the one hand, it can actually deny claims that simply don't meet payment requirements.
And under the Affordable Care Act, there was more authorities given as well?
Correct.
And so how many fraudulent claims have been stopped using FPS going out the door?
I don't know that I could give you at this, we can get the number for you later, of actual claims denials. But again, the FPS has capabilities that allow us, in some cases, if a payment policy is simply not met, to deny the claim, no payment goes out the door. In other circumstances, it makes our investigation more efficient and effective so that we can stop perhaps the payment of all claims. 100% payment suspension can be put in place. We can work with law enforcement. We can work with our own boots-on-the-ground staff, conduct the investigation that then allows us to take a more stringent administrative
Are
action.
claims being flagged today and not being paid using FPS?
Yes.
They are being, and you can give us those numbers
Sure,
if we
yes.
need them? That would be wonderful. So, my only question then is why the improper payment rate is going up?
Again, I think we have to separate improper payments from fraud. Fraud is a legal determination made by the criminal justice system.
But
Well-
FPS is still utilized to help stop improper payments as well, not just fraud, correct?
Initially, because of the focus on fraud and abuse, obviously the legitimate and necessary focus, we designed a lot of our models in the FPS to directly address issues of extreme outlier behavior that we could then take significant administrative actions against and work with law enforcement about. And our referral rate has actually been steadily increasing to law enforcement. What we see now as the system has matured is we can move it upstream and try to address other types of improper payments. So, for example, we've worked with our Medicare administrative contractors who conduct medical review on a daily basis. And in a pilot, we are actually utilizing the FPS to better focus their medical review efforts. That is not the same community of providers as we have been very focused on in our work because they're extreme outliers. This community is not so much an outlier. They're probably legitimate providers that are just not billing the program ideally.
So necessarily, at the beginning, you were not looking at certain providers, only some that you identified could be potentially participating in fraudulent behavior.
Well, I think we want to be very careful with our administrative authorities because they can be extremely disruptive. 100% payment suspension can put some providers out of business.
How many
And so
Medicare providers are there?
there are about between 1.5 and 1.6 million enrolled providers.
And
and
FPS
suppliers.
allows you to look at their behaviors and identify traits that may be fraudulent?
We see 4.5 million claims per day in FPS that address all of those provider types. We identify extremely aberrant outlier claims, and the system actually helps us prioritize not only the claims, but the providers for further investigation.
So not just fraudulent, but also improper.
Well, again, we are well in front of the criminal justice process. We don't determine that something is fraudulent. We determine that it's outlier and either should be paid or should not be paid.
So can you tell me why CMS has not used crowdsource fraud prevention in the past?
Well, I think the small business...
It uses more of the analytics, and that hasn't been utilized by CMS, correct, through FPS?
The FPS is an advanced analytics system. So what it does is it takes existing models, and we actually asked about crowdsourcing. We take input from a wide variety of sources. I guess that's the
So that
definition
is,
of crowdsourcing.
okay, so that is being utilized.
In order to develop these models, we get that input from our zone program integrity contractors. We get it from law enforcement. We get it from, we even incorporate information from our beneficiary complaints, which is, I guess, another form of crowdsourcing. All of those things can feed and create, allow the development for these models that then look at the claims themselves.
Okay, do you have any regulatory or statutory or anything that's in statute that would prevent you from being able to use more crowdsourcing? Is there anything that would tie your hands from being able to rely even more on those analytics?
I think we have a variety of ways of getting input. I'm not sure specifically. We can perhaps take that question back. One source that I didn't highlight yet is we actually are in a public-private partnership with a number of private plans. I guess that's another form of crowdsourcing where we exchange best practices and data with them. And that's also been a really useful source of leads and information for us.
And is
them,
that useful when you're dealing with fraud prevention or improper payments?
In our world, these things really run together. I mean, there isn't a sharp line when you say, well, this claim is now moved from sort of waste to abuse or fraud. Again, we don't make that fraud
But you did say earlier in
determination.
your statement, didn't you, though, that you were focused mainly on fraud prevention to begin with and weren't as concerned with improper payments?
We haven't...
That is how you developed your FPS system.
We started, the FPS focus has been on some of the highest outliers, because those outliers really do merit the administrative actions and other activities that law enforcement can generate against them. They stand far and above other providers, even compared to their specialty or compared to their geographic peers. We are, as the fraud prevention system has matured, we are trying to pilot and think of ways of moving it even further upstream to address legitimate providers that don't necessarily, they're not trying to push the envelope into abuse and fraud, but are really, just not meeting certain payment requirements or misusing modifiers, misusing certain codes, to see if we can get the system to help focus our efforts on the right set of providers there.
Well, considering the amount of improper payments and the fact that those numbers go up, I think that's a great place to focus.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Mr. Kelly is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for both being here. I come from the private sector, and what I compare a lot of what you do is to what I've done. I'm a mobile dealer, and I got to tell you that I had a discussion with one of our General Motors service people today, and what I'm having trouble understanding is with the data that we collect. I mean, the IRS has absolutely no problem finding out who deposits what where, and actually can freeze your accounts when they see something being done improperly, even if it's not proved yet. I think the confusion is when I look at the amounts of dollars that we're talking about, and if it's really as high as it is, that for some reason, if we have this data, if you go to an automobile, you have its birth date, the day it's produced has a serial number. From that time to the time it's scrapped, we know who owns that car, where that car is, and everything about it. And what I have trouble understanding is with these, whether it's improper payments or whatever fraud, you're still using taxpayer money that is being used in a wrong way. I mean, we're arguing now over a budget and worrying about how we're going to defend, our sequester and defense is about $100 billion. We're talking about Medicare and Medicaid paid out $77.4 billion in improper payments. That's money that probably could have used better elsewhere. So my question comes down really, if we have all this analytical data, and I go back to my years in the car business. A couple years ago, General Motors had a problem with ignitions. They said if you have too much weight on your keychain, it turns the car off. Well, I'm still in the automobile business. We had to go back to owners of 2005 and 2006 cars. We have cars that ran off the road and gone into a river and were retrieved and rebuilt. General Motors is still responsible for the safety recalls. If you were to drive your car into our service department today, doctor, and it's a General Motors car, I can use through the VIS program, the vehicle identification system, I can find every single repair done to that car, the day it was done, the mileage that was on the car, the technician that did the work on the car, which would be the doctor working on somebody, the parts that were used, and if it was truly done that way. So I'm constantly sitting down with General Motors. They go across all this data, say, you know what? You guys seem to have a higher repair rate when it comes to brakes. That doesn't match up with what happens in your area. So all this data that we collect the data, but we're not getting any closer to getting this fixed. And what I really am worried about is we're talking about $125 billion of taxpayer money that has been wasted. And $77 billion of it is through Medicare and Medicaid programs. And there has to be some way with the collection of this data. Who's analyzing the data and who's looking at it? It can't be that we don't know where the improper payments are being made. And whether it's fraud or improper payments, to me it's the same thing. It's wasted taxpayer dollars. Mr. Cantrell, you all have access to data that is incredibly deep into everything. And as I said, the IRS, they know every day who deposited money across the country in different banks. We can ferret out those people, but we can't find out where $77.5 billion of improper payments are going. That to me is inconceivable in a government that has data and has the ability to track every phone call we make, every movement we make, but we can't find out where this money is going and say, my God, this is taxpayer money that's being wasted in a country that's looking to put money where the best return is on it for the people who put it in, the taxpayers. We're still playing in the dirt with this stuff, still trying to figure it out. So all the data that you're doing, and as Mr. Meehan talked about, who are we going after and why are we going after? I got to tell you something. You're an automobile dealer and you have these kind of numbers, one of two things are going to happen to you. First of all, you're going to lose your franchise, and secondly, you're going to get tried in a court for improper payments and for fraud. So tell me, where are we going with this? Where do you see this going? Because the numbers have gone up. And listen, I have a collection agency that collects money from me. After it goes beyond 180 days, I'm not going to go chasing somebody. I don't have time to do it, but we turn over a collection agency. You know what we pay them? We pay them 35 cents on the dollar that they retrieve. So please tell me where we're going with these programs and how are we protecting taxpayers' money?
I think protection of taxpayer dollars is absolutely important. So I think what's important also is not to view any specific tool or process as a standalone. We use these things together to try to be as preventive and effective in our actions as possible. The FPS, the automated provider screening system, these are examples of tools that we have at our disposal. We have other tools. Prior authorization stops payments from being made that don't meet our requirements. prepay reviews, post-pay reviews. We have a moratorium that's been implemented in different parts of the country that stops the enrollment of providers. Because again, we know that that gateway to Medicare is so important that if we stop bad actors at the door, it is highly preventive and stops the flow of dollars. All of these things have to work in concert to really drive down all manners of waste, as you identify. One thing I would also add is outreach and education to the provider community is central in this. I'm not purporting to educate the really, really bad actors that just want to steal from the program. But again, the 60% of the improper payment rate that's driven by documentation challenges, we absolutely need to be working with providers to educate them on our documentation requirements, get that documentation to improve. I think what you'll see is that the improper payment rate can come down because of issues like documentation, but the dollars going out won't necessarily change because the providers will be better educated to meet our requirements, that they're documenting appropriately. The contention isn't that the services weren't provided or that they weren't necessary, it's just that the documentation didn't match. We can do a much better job outreaching to these physicians and get that level of awareness improved.
Mr. Crowley is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today as well. I think it's important to remember that the Congress has a responsibility to enact laws, but also for oversight purposes. So I appreciate you doing this in a responsible way. Dr. Welcome, Mr. Cantor, welcome as well. On the next panel, we'll have a witness from Visa. And while CMS and Visa both use predictive modeling, see if we can, boy, that's pretty powerful, isn't it? You can hear me breathing. I can only assume that healthcare is not the same as consumer purchases. You can't return a repaired knee, for instance, after you've used it. How is CMS different from a credit card company? And how do these differences affect how CMS does their fraud-fighting job? Both respond.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think we are very different from a credit card company, even though some of our technology and the way we utilize it can look similar on the surface. There's three big differences I'd highlight. One is medical claims are highly complex. I think more complex than the typical financial transaction on a credit card. Second, the medical claim is really just a shadow of what actually happened in the clinical setting. For anyone to know what actually occurred in that clinical interaction, you have to look at the underlying medical record, which typically does not come to CMS or any payer alongside the claim. And third, we have major access to care issues that we want to keep from occurring just because of payment denials. So let me talk a little bit more about these. First, on the complexity. Medical claims are not unidimensional financial transactions. They have information about the provider, which we have 1.5 to 1.6 million of in our program. They contain information about the beneficiary, which we have over 50 million of in our program. And they utilize a language of codes and modifiers. We have more than 11,000 of those codes that can be built on a Medicare claim. Those things can all be combined in various combinations that make analyzing a claim far more sophisticated and involved a process than looking at dollar amounts coming from a particular vendor attached to a particular credit card. Looking at aberrancies, connecting these claims over time can be very challenging and far more involved, I think, than the typical financial transaction. Second, medical review or medical record. So the claim is a bill. But it was generated after there was a clinical interaction that is really documented in the medical record. The medical record does not come to CMS with the claim, nor does it go to any payer typically. We only see medical records when we audit claims, and we audit far less than 1% of claims, given that we get over 1 billion claims per year. So oftentimes, in order to corroborate that a claim is actually aberrant, we have to look at the underlying medical record and see what was aberrant about that clinical interaction. Again, requiring more documentation than you typically need in a financial transaction. And third, access to care. When we deny a claim, whether it's one claim or a series of claims, we are denying payment to a physician or provider and denying claim about a service that a beneficiary may really need. We want to be very careful when doing that because we don't want to cause access problems in our program because of an admittedly very vigilant and very productive program integrity approach. These things always have to hang in the balance with each other. We know that we're not denying payment for a TV. We're denying payment for what could be a legitimate medical service. We want to make sure we do that very carefully.
Mr. Cantor, before you respond, if I could just, for the sake of time, get another question, and you can also elaborate on this first question as well. But we all know that healthcare fraud goes beyond Medicare and Medicaid. How is CMS and other agencies with the federal government working to involve the private sector in anti-fraud efforts?
Sure, I'll start. The Healthcare Fraud Prevention Partnership is something that CMS is leading, and we're participating in since the very beginning of conversations about developing this partnership that includes private payers. There's a lot we can learn from each other. Fraud, as you said, doesn't just affect government programs, it affects private insurance as well. So we often see, and we do see, the same schemes perpetrated against both public and private. And we work very closely in certain investigations to ensure that those private funds are recouped when someone is stolen from both programs. So that partnership is meant to increase and build upon that relationship, begin sharing data, and I think that's going to be important for us going down in the future.
I agree with everything that Mr. Cantrell has said. The only thing I'd add is we are also working, beyond the partnership context, which I certainly agree with. We are working to extend our reach into other private plans. So Medicare Part C plans, Part D plans, where we've been working very hard in the agency to get encounter data, other sources of data from these plans so that we can better assess the kind of utilization that's occurring. We recently, at the end of last year, extended our enrollment requirements into Part D. So that we could have direct line of sight on prescribers in Part D, and they currently relate mainly to Part D plan sponsors. But we're extending our authority there so that we can roll out many of the same enrollment and screening approaches that we have in A and B to Part D. We're also doing the same on the Medicaid side and looking to work much more closely with Medicaid managed care plans in the private sector.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Holding is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a brief opening statement, which I'm going to put in the record, but I want to jump right into the questioning and pick up again on a theme that Mr. Meehan touched on regarding interagency coordination between CMS, HHS, and DOJ. So to the both of you, do you think this interagency coordination is as good as it can be? Mr. Agarwal, Dr. Agarwal, you can start.
Thank you. I think it can always be improved. So we've done a lot in terms of data sharing. Basically every system that I have access to, law enforcement has access to as well. That includes our fraud investigations database, our FPS that we've been discussing, the integrated data repository at CMS that is a large cache of a huge number of Medicare claims and other analytical tools. So we've certainly done a lot to try to make sure that law enforcement entities have access to all the data that CMS can provide,
So
and I'm sure we can do more there.
When FPS is generating leads, you see the anomalies and you find the leads and you prioritize them. So do you turn around and share those directly with OIG?
We give OIG real-time direct access to the system itself, so they can see leads as they're being generated. In addition, it's
does OIG take advantage of that? I mean, do you see the leads there and you proceed?
We use other systems they've
pursuing
made
those?
available to us more directly than the actual fraud prevention system. We have tools that the IDR, the Integrated Data Repository, 1PI, these are tools that we didn't have 5 years ago. So I will say that access to data has been an area of great improvement over the last 5 years or so, and the partnership has led directly to that. We have over 200 individuals from our office who have direct access to this Medicare claims data that we didn't have before. Now we have access to prescription drug data that we didn't have before through these systems. I think there are definitely areas where we could, that Dr. Agarwal mentioned before, Medicare managed care, Medicaid data, and prescription drug data, where we can improve upon that access to data and
So you're saying
monitor
you don't have access. Is that an obstacle then, that not having access to that specific data there?
We have access to parts of that data, but it isn't the same level of access, kind of near real-time access that we had to fee-for-service data. So there's definitely some opportunities there to build upon what we've done in fee-for-service so that we can have that level of near real-time access to managed care data. We know there's fraud out there, but we just don't have visibility right now into Part C, really.
So do you have any way of evaluating or measuring the quality of your coordination? Is there a standard by which you can measure it?
I think it's very subjective in terms of that. We have so many leads that come from so many sources, and CMS, the referrals we get from the contractors are just one small part of that. In fact, I think it's about 10 to 15% of the leads we get, the cases that we open, are coming from CMS referrals. We work with our law enforcement partners. That's the bulk of the information we get. Whistleblowers have always been the greatest
So
lead.
it seems like you got a lot of leads and a lot of information coming in. But they're not being prioritized. They're, just kind of coming into a basket, and you're trying to figure out.
They're absolutely.
FPS gets leads, and you prioritize them. So OIG is getting a bunch of information from a lot of different sources. And do you have a method for prioritizing?
We absolutely do. So we have a process. Every lead that comes in the office goes through an analysis by our special agents in charge, our assistant special agents in charge, the investigators. They balance it against existing workloads and determine based on whether there's potential harm to patients, the financial impact on the case. What level of evidence has been provided up front? Is it a whistleblower, or is it an anonymous lead with nothing really to corroborate that information? So we prioritize continuously.
So in the next panel, we're going to have some witnesses. I've read the written testimony, and they point out that if you could share all this information across the entire spectrum, that it'd be a much more effective way to combat waste, fraud, and abuse. Now, I understand their privacy concerns, but do you all see a way forward to share this data uniformly across the spectrum of stakeholders in here who want to combat waste, fraud, and abuse? And Dr. Agarwal, you want to hit that? And
Sure.
we're running
Absolutely.
out of time, so make it quick.
Yeah, I'll do my
It's all
best. I've not been known for making it quick, but I'll try. I think that's absolutely right. One of the principles behind the Healthcare Fraud Prevention Partnership that Mr. Cantrell mentioned is exactly data sharing. I think for it to be effective, it has to be purposeful, purpose-driven, right? So it isn't just a huge mass of data without any guidelines for what that data means or why we're sharing it. In the partnership, we've taken a very steady, objective-driven approach to sharing that data. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? What's the minimum amount of data that we need to exchange in order to meet that objective? So that we're not just exchanging a bunch of data that then overwhelms systems, overwhelms staff time to sift through it. We're doing it in a very purposeful driven way. I think that's the key to all this, so that we're really achieving impact with all of this data work.
Mr. Cantrell, I'll allow you to follow up in writing. Thank you. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Smith is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My understanding is that the FPS generates leads for investigations by showing anomalies in claims data. I want to know if there's a risk that the FPS system would flag legitimate claims and send them for investigations to a contractor, and could this potentially tie up resources on legitimate claims instead of going after actually fraudulent ones? Doctor, what does CMS do to mitigate this concern, and does CMS have any standard procedures in place to screen leads from the FPS before sending them on to the ZPICs?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So our screening and prioritization process starts up front when the model is being developed. So we develop these models working with our contractors that know what's happening on the ground. We develop them working with law enforcement and get their input on not just what is outlier behavior, because anybody can find that in a data set, but really the outlier behavior that we ought to be most concerned about, that we can take administrative action against, that might be threatening the health and safety of our beneficiaries. And that is, I think, very specific, experience-driven knowledge that we can imbue in the models right at the front end, so that we're sifting out, outlier behavior that's otherwise pretty innocent. Secondly, even when, once claims start streaming through the system against the model, there's an internal prioritization based on just how many times you're hitting that model or a variety of models, right? So the more models you hit, the worse you look as a billing provider or supplier. And I think the system does a great job of helping us further prioritize things just in a very technology, data-driven manner. And finally, and extremely importantly, we don't take administrative actions without human beings getting involved, except where it's very clear that a single claim doesn't meet payment requirements, right? We can deny that kind of claim. But when you're trying to build a case, you need to do other on-the-ground work. You need to talk to the provider. You need to get medical records. You need to interview beneficiaries. That human interaction makes sure that we're not implementing an administrative action against an otherwise legitimate provider.
What is the rate of false positives in the leads generated by the system?
I'm not sure that it makes sense actually to speak in terms of a false positive rate, because again, there's so many filters that stand between a claim coming in and being labeled aberrant or flagged in some way, and an administrative action being taken. Those filters are both technology driven as well as human driven, as I described. Our focus has been, let's not take an administrative action against a provider supplier that's legitimate or has a billing problem that we can correct through education and outreach. We want to reserve the administrative actions for those providers and suppliers that are really egregious. The only manner of correcting their behavior is the administrative action, or they've demonstrated a consistent unwillingness to follow our policies. So in that sense, because there isn't just an automated trigger leading to an action, it doesn't really make sense to speak in terms of false positive rates.
So there's no data to say that there's any kind of false positives.
I don't think that there is. I mean, that's a question that I can take back to our analysts and see if they track anything like that. I think what we actually spend more of our time on is rolling out models and then, getting input from our contractors, from other sources, to help us decide, is the model working or not? And where the model's not working, we can make refinements to get it to improve.
Okay, that leads to my next question. According to GAO in 2012, only 5% of all fraud contractor leads came from the FPS. Do you have updated numbers on that?
Not that I'm aware of, but again, I can take that back and see if there's updated numbers. That GAO report was quite early, as you know, in the development of the FPS. As we were building the technology, we had outstanding questions about how to integrate that with our existing work and what portion of the work it should drive. I think what the GAO found was something like 10% of all of our work was initially driven by the FPS. As the FPS matures, takes on more models, and its adoption rate has increased, I expect that number has gone up. But again, we can take that as a request back to determine.
That'd be great. Once the contractor gets the lead, what happens?
So a variety of actions can be taken. One thing that we've tried to do to make the FPS system more user-friendly is by trying to present information in a way that makes it more actionable immediately for the contractor. So they don't just get a bunch of data and numbers. They actually get this data organized in a way that helps them do their investigative work. So what they will do often is they will take the data from the FPS. They can utilize other systems like 1PI to do any other additional analysis that needs to be done. They can conduct very manual processes like interviewing providers, interviewing beneficiaries, conducting site visits, conducting medical review of the underlying medical record, and then ultimately building that case for an administrative action or law enforcement referral.
Thank you. Dr. Agrawal, I've got a few questions for you. As I was reading your testimony and then listening to you this morning, I felt like I was the sales manager listening to a salesman who'd been out working hard, making a bunch of sales calls, and was coming in and saying, look, I called on this customer, and I've done this, and I took this person to lunch, and I feel kind of like the sales manager that's saying, hey, where's the orders? Where is the final product? And I recognize that you're in a complicated milieu, and I'm not here for a second saying that the responsibility that you have is easy, or that, I've got the Peter Roskam 5-point easy solution for solving. Yeah, I've got that on a laminated bookmark for you, my friend. So I accept at face value that this is terribly complicated. But when I opened with this idea, and that is, look, we are really struggling on Capitol Hill right now to fund a super important program as it relates to Medicare. These choices that are before us are all revenue-seeking choices, basically. And this SGR deal that's being negotiated, the doc fix, is really, really hard. It's hard on providers. and it's hard on seniors, and it's hard on everybody. And then I look across the table at you, figuratively, based on your responsibility, and I think you've got the answer. You've got the money. And you have this incredible responsibility, and I listen today and I read, and I feel underwhelmed by the direction that things are going. I just want to put something up on the board, which is sort of my frame of reference. And you exchanged with Mr. Crowley, and you made the argument, look, this is different than a Visa bill. And I accept that it's kind of different than a Visa bill, but I don't think it's this different. So Visa is doing $10 trillion. I mean, that's thousands of billions of dollars on an annual basis, and their numbers are practically de minimis compared to 12 billion. And so, or a 12% rate. There was something that you said in your testimony, and then you reiterated it. You had it in your written testimony. It jumped out at me, and you reiterated it today. I just want to read a sentence to you and tell you how it struck me. So this is what you said, and it's not a bad thing, but just sort of the way in which it was presented, I perceived it differently than what you were trying to communicate. So this is what you said. When FPS models identify egregious, suspect, or aberrant activity, the system automatically generates and prioritizes leads for review and investigation by CMS's zone program integrity contractors. Now, you would say that, and you'd say, hey, that's a good thing. I read that, and I say, you've got to be kidding me. That this process is so slow and so ridiculous and so hamstrung that it's this identifying leads and all this sort of process. We're going to hear later on, I think, from Ms. Frazira, who's going to give us an example in Miami. You may have seen her testimony, but an example in Miami where they identify this stuff and say, this is a real problem. She goes to the IG, and it's slow. Meanwhile, money's going out the door. So I think what you're hearing from many folks on this committee is the level of activity is significant. Nobody's arguing that you're not working hard. But what we're saying is this has to improve. And this is not like a hope and a dream sort of improve. This has to improve because this amount of money going out, and we're talking, I mean, you know these numbers better than I do. You're marinating in this stuff. These numbers have to improve because it is simply unsustainable and the public's losing confidence and so forth. So here's a couple of questions. You started to address this when Ms. Noem was asking, but I don't think you got to it. Why is the improper payment rate going up?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest drivers of the improper payment rate is documentation. So here again, I think we see the balance of being more vigilant on program integrity and then at the same time potentially driving up the rate. One of the biggest drivers of the improper payment rate is the home health face-to-face requirement, which was part of the Affordable Care Act. I think we can all agree that a clinician seeing a beneficiary who needs home health services and having that interaction be face-to-face, documenting the need for home health is a strong solution. It helps address one of the areas that we know has been endemic with aberrancies and problems, home health services. While I think the concept makes a lot of sense, the idea is very clear. Providers have a hard time documenting that face-to-face encounter. And so the home health improper payment rate has now jumped to over 50%, large part driven by this, I think, well-meaning, well-intentioned, well-thought-out face-to-face requirement. So one could argue, let's eliminate the requirement, but I think that's not the right answer clinically, right? The right answer for us is educate these otherwise legitimate providers and get them to raise their level of documentation so that it meets our standards. That would bring down the improper payment rate. You can see this in a wide variety of clinical circumstances. And again, so you can see it in DME.
That there's been a new factor that's been introduced. The new factor is a new requirement, and that's influencing the payment rate. Do you have, or the improper payment rate?
And there's a variety of new factors.
Okay.
Correct.
I got it. Do you have confidence that's the intervening cause, or and that's it alone?
Yeah, we don't just measure a high-level improper payment rate. We drill that down to the specific provider categories, the types of services that are leading that rate. Home health is consistently elevated and has gotten higher. DME supplies are consistently elevated. Skilled nursing facilities consistently elevated. So a lot of our activities around lowering the rate focus on the areas of the highest errors.
So why are Medicare, why are only 1% of FPS, why does FPS only have an impact on 1% of Medicare claims?
I think FPS is a new system. In part, that's the answer, right? So the initiating legislation, as obviously you well know, came out in 2010. This is our third year of operations. Our maturity in building the system has improved dramatically every single year. We are, if your point is we need to do more, we are totally aligned on that. We want to do more. I have a staff that
What's
works.
holding you back? I mean, 1% just seems incredibly underwhelming.
I think it is not just, we've made a lot of investments in data analytics to identify leads for our work. Those investments are paying off. I think what we need to focus on is getting much more efficient from lead to final action. Certainly, I spend a lot of my time focused on making our contractors more efficient, measuring their performance, making sure that we're paying them to do the work that we want, and getting the work and getting the kind of end results that we're looking for. So again, it's a continuum of activities. It's not just get a lead and take an action. We do have to meet a bar for taking an action. We do need to be fair to providers, even the bad actors, to make sure that we're doing this the right way. And we want to do it in a way that doesn't victimize the innocent, legitimate providers that are just doing their work.
How can you not know the number of claims that have been stopped by FPS?
We do. I'll get you that number. I can give you a dollar amount as well as the number of claims.
Okay. I know that you use all these tools in conjunction with one another, but how do you identify whether one program, especially FPS, is working in particular? So what's the metric to say, I mean, if you're only hitting up against 1%, what's the metric to say it's working at all?
The FPS, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, we have a very viable metric working with the Office of Inspector General. As you know, the statute required certification of our savings numbers. We've engaged in an audit every single year since the FPS has been implemented, including this year. And the OIG certified both our identified savings number as well as the adjusted number. So I think that's an extremely viable metric of the financial impact of FPS. In addition, what we published in our report last year are all the actions that FPS has led to beyond the financial impact, right? We've taken administrative action against more than 900 providers and suppliers because of the FPS, not all the other processes that we have, which are numerous, but specifically because of the FPS. We've initiated new cases and investigations because of the FPS. We've made existing cases get more efficiently to outcome because of the FPS. Again, that's a focused piece of work and audit on the FPS, but my point, I think, continues to be the FPS is one tool at our disposal. Look at the broader picture, and you'll see a picture where we really have moved from a pay-and-chase model to a prevention-based model.
So the funding for FPS is coming to a close. Where are we on that? And if so, how are you paying for it?
So at the end of this fiscal year, we will have exhausted the initial funds given to us through the Small Business Jobs Act. And what we are doing is transitioning the FPS to utilizing other existing program integrity funds.
Do you, getting back to your point that this is a more complicated system than Visa, doesn't that create more opportunities for you, though? Doesn't that actually create more data points and more opportunities to say, no, that's looking weird, and that's looking off, and that's inconsistent, and so forth, rather than just trying to figure out if Joe Crowley is buying, $10,000 worth of stereo equipment.
Mr. Chairman, keep me out of it if you don't mind.
Did you follow me? I mean, you got a lot of data. You got a lot of stuff. And to your own point, look, this is highly complicated and integrated. But doesn't that create more opportunities, sort of more facets to look at? And that if they are off, you can see the hues and the angles are off, and it just doesn't make sense, so don't pay it?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I think we are trying to utilize every available opportunity to take administrative action. So again, we have lots of tools. We can conduct the site visits that I mentioned. We have the enrollment screening requirements. We have analytic systems like the FPS. We can conduct social network analysis that looks at how one provider relates to another provider,
But see,
especially
if all
as...
that is happening well, then the number gets closer to the Visa number.
But again, this number is the improper payment rate, right? So these providers don't necessarily need to be kicked out of the program. They have a problem, which is documentation or providing the right service in the wrong location. But those are not the same types of problems that we want to address by kicking folks out of the program. Those are the problems that everyday clinicians have.
Yeah, but you're arguing how many angels can dance on the head of a pin here. We're still talking about 12.7% of money, dollars, that are going out the door, dollars that can't be used for the doc fix, for example. So I understand that there's a distinction that in some cases is an important distinction with a difference. But in this case, it's sort of a distinction without a difference. The money is still the money. You're still at 12.7%, and Visa is I mean, they're not just lapping you. You know what I mean? This is not even in the same order of magnitude with them. And I guess it comes down to this, and let me just close by this. I think both sides of the aisle have a very high expectation of what you are doing, and you're viewed as the trustee of literally billions of dollars. Yeah, it's gotten more complicated over the years. The fraudsters and the hustlers are totally on top of their game, and they're super aggressive and super bright. But we have to have an improvement all the way around. And yes, it's a more complicated system than buying a stereo and so forth. But out of that complication comes a real opportunity in terms of more exposure. And so I think that the sense that you're getting from this subcommittee today is that we look with an urgency about what you are doing. And we're rooting for you, but we're disappointed. I am. And I know, listen, nobody wants to disappoint people, but that's all said, we've got to improve this whole scene. So I appreciate your coming in, and I appreciate very much your disposition. Oh, and we've been joined, by the gentlelady from Tennessee. So let me yield to her for a question as well.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for being tardy. It's, as you know, a very busy day, but very interesting subject, and I appreciate being able to ask a question. So, Mr. Agarwal, I want to ask you, has your FPS system, I understand, is working better this year? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So you mentioned the public-private partnership. Are they also working better this year?
I think that partnership has continued to grow and expand, yes.
Okay. So, Mr. Cantrell, are CMS and law enforcement partnerships also working better this year than last year?
We're constantly in a state of improvement, I'd say.
Do you think that it is working better this year than it was?
Our access to data is better than it ever has been. I think we're working very closely to identify that point in time where we turn from administrative action to investigation and prosecution.
So you both say that it is working better, and yet what we see is an increase rather than a decrease in the fraud. So can you address that, why that might be the case? Mr. Cantrell, you want to go first?
Sure. I think, one, we have greater visibility. We're seeing more in the data, so we're able to identify more suspect providers. That's potentially part of it. Just the fact that we can now see more than we used to be able to see through the data and identify potentially fraudulent providers. That's part of it. We have seen an increase in our criminal convictions. Once people get past the front lines of defense, of prevention, there are more of them committing fraud against the program that we're actually identifying and convicting. I think that's a product of our deploying our resources based on the data to the areas where the fraud is greatest. So our strike force teams have increased criminal convictions because we're putting our resources in areas where there is the most fraud and the greatest amount of risk. So I think that in part is due to just our being more effective and putting our resources where they can have the greatest impact.
Would you like to also answer, Mr. Agarwal?
I actually think that was a very complete answer. I agree with it.
Well, as the chairman has already said, we applaud you for continuing work, but when we see that the numbers are increasing rather than decreasing, and I certainly understand that now that you have a better system where you can identify them, that you're going to see more of that. But we've got to be able to tell our constituents that we're doing everything we can with their tax dollars to make sure we're protecting them. So I'll be very interested to hear as you move forward about the successes rather than what we're seeing, the increases. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Agarwal, one other question. Can you divide out how much of is fraud versus improper payments?
No, that is a very challenging question. There isn't a ready answer for that kind of question. There is no methodology currently that determines that a claim is fraudulent versus something else. The center has actually been working on devising such a methodology. We have an initial pilot that we'll be launching, looking at home health claims, and actually doing, as you can imagine, in order to figure out that a claim is fraudulent, you've actually got to do all the work in terms of figuring out what's underneath that claim. Was the beneficiary seen? Was there a face-to-face encounter? Was the order legitimate? Were services given? All that stuff, and put it together in a picture of that claim to tell you, yes, this claim is potentially fraudulent or not. So we have devised such a methodology. We'll be rolling it out and trying to arrive at the first real fraud rate in a particular benefit category, but there's currently no such rate that we're aware of.
It seems amazing to me. I mean, really foundational that you don't have that capacity to know, to be able to discern one from the other. I mean, I'm really surprised by that, because how do you know how to direct resources then?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So the reason it's challenging is because fraud is a legal determination.
I understand it's
right?
challenging.
Well, it's more, so yes, it's hard, but it's also almost, if it takes a legal determination to say that a claim is fraudulent, then that quickly leaves the sphere of control that we have, right? I mean, that's a criminal justice determination. What we can do is establish that services were not granted, which is often very indicative of fraud.
There's a difference, though. So let's not parse the legal stuff. You may not be able to prove, the prosecutors may not be able to prove in a court of law intent and all that sort of stuff. But when something is, it's not just a physician who didn't check the right box off or write the right sort of question. That's poor documentation. But if there's a malicious intent to get at this, that's not bad documentation. And it seems like it's a super important point, particularly as it relates to the third point you made in talking to Mr. Crowley, and that was kind of your inherent defensiveness about, hey, this is an access to care issue, and if we pull the plug on this, then it's going to adversely impact patients and so forth. So I find it amazing that you don't know, that you can't discern between the two. And there's probably nothing you're going to say right now that is going to take away that sense of wonder. And we've just joined by the ranking member, and with your welcome, Mr. Lewis. I understand that you've been detained, and you're now recognized, if you'd like to be, for your opening statement, which can kind of be a closing statement, but it's a good statement nevertheless.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I must apologize to you and other members for being late. I had to be over on the other side of the Capitol, in the other body, to introduce a candidate that the President has nominated to become the Deputy Attorney General. So that has kept me. I understand that we're going through the question phase.
We've just finished with the first panel.
Okay. Could I yield to Mr. Crowley to raise a question?
By all means.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, Doctor and Mr. Cantrell, the image that the chairman has placed up is interesting when you look at the difference between what is done in the private sector in terms of Visa and banking fraud, and the number 12.7% it's an incredible number to look at. I was wondering, though, that under the Affordable Care Act, you've been given new tools to help go after fraudulent works. Could you describe for us, Mr. Cantrell, some of those new tools in terms of criminal prosecutions and I believe denying a re-enrollment by doctors who have conducted willful acts of fraud? And could you also tell us what would happen to those new tools if the Affordable Care Act were to be undone?
Well, I think most of the tools that were given in the Affordable Care Act are administrative tools that CMS deploys. We were given an initial amount of funding, which allowed us to increase our boots on the ground, our agents out in our strike force cities, which has been very helpful. Some of the administrative tools that CMS does have, we work with them to deploy those tools to stop payments as early as we can in our investigations and support those the stoppage of payments in fraud cases.
So you're absolutely right that the Affordable Care Act gave the agency a number of new tools. The provider enrollment standards that you discussed, we're on a 5-year cycle now, revalidating every single provider and supplier in Medicare. We'll do that every 5 years. We're actually at the end of our first 5-year cycle. After nearly being complete with that revalidation process, over 500,000 enrollments have been removed from the program, so they can no longer bill.
So have doctors actually been disenrolled?
Doctors, DME suppliers, home health agencies, absolutely.
For fraudulent acts?
Well, for not meeting enrollment requirements.
Under the Affordable Care Act?
Yes.
The new tools you were given?
Absolutely.
So would that be a tool that would be taken away from CMS if the Affordable Care Act is undermined?
Yeah, our approach to screening and enrollment and revalidation is almost entirely dependent on the Affordable Care Act.
So to some degree, is it fair to say that some of the tools that you have and that you're now employing are starting to make their way through the system, and people are beginning to understand just the serious nature of what ought to have been obvious in the first place in terms of the fraud that had been taking place both by physicians and patients? Is that something that you think is happening now? We should expect to see this number go down?
I think there is a strong sentinel effect of our activities that is beginning to take hold. So, revocation allows us to kick a provider out of Medicare, essentially stopping all Medicare reimbursement. That's very disruptive for the vast majority of providers. Where we, OIG can actually take an even more disruptive action, obviously a very positive one, which is exclusion. And that doesn't allow them to participate in any program, any federal program. And I think, being able to take on data from the OIG about who's been excluded, being able to take our own revocation actions, they have significant sentinel effects. People see that and say, I think I need to fly straight, or I want to fly straight because I don't want to run afoul of this.
Right. So folks who are watching this on C-SPAN or are paying attention to this hearing today, this is an opportunity to send a message loud and clear that the sheriffs in town now have new tools.
Yes, sir.
That
All
they
three
did not
people
have
watching
before
C-SPAN. Yes,
under the Affordable Care Act that were not in place before that, and that if they go astray of the rules and of the law, that they will fully be prosecuted under the Affordable Care Act. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate your hearing today. And I do think this number is a serious number that needs to be addressed. I also believe under the Affordable Care Act and the tools that have been given to CMS and to the administration as well overall in justice, that we're going to see that number come down. And with that, I yield back to the gentleman from Georgia.
You're back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I'd like to thank our panel for being with us this morning. Appreciate your time and your courtesy and your willingness to invest it with us. And you're dismissed, and we'll welcome our second panel to join us.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I'm sorry I missed your testimony. Thank you very much. Have a copy. I will read it. Thank you. Well, good to meet you, sir. Thank you.
Are your nameplates working? Well, as we've previously announced, I now recognize Mr. Lewis for his opening statement.
But, Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing and for your work on this important issue. I also would like to thank all of the witnesses for being here today. Thank you for giving of your time. On July 30th, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed a bipartisan law to establish Medicare and Medicaid. It was a great step in realizing a long overdue promise to America's seniors. The federal government will never forget the lesson of the Great Depression, where the sick, the poor, and the downtrodden felt hopeless and forgotten. The success of Medicare did not just happen overnight. It took decades of work, study, and negotiation to develop this sacred pact with seniors. For years, our predecessors on this very committee worked tirelessly to get the package just right. We have a responsibility to do everything in our power to ensure that this program continues for generations yet unborn. Today, there are about 54 million senior citizens and persons with disabilities who depend on Medicare. These people are our parents, our neighbors, and our friends. Every American, especially those who worked their entire lives, deserve a federal safety net. They are entitled to a program that works. I want to thank the administration for working with us to fight fraud in the Medicare program. Nearly 50 years ago, this Congress made historic progress in ensuring that every American has a chance to live a healthy, long life. The Affordable Care Act continued that dream. This landmark health care law provided the government with better tools to prevent fraud. Just last year, government and anti-fraud program recovered more than $3 billion from individuals and companies who tried to defraud the program. In the last 3 years, this administration has recovered $7 for every dollar spent on anti-fraud investigations. These savings have real benefits for Americans who rely on Medicare every single day. We must do all we can to protect Medicare. It is not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. It is an American responsibility. Today, I look forward to learning what more is needed to fight Medicare fraud and protect this important national treasure. Again, I would like to thank the witnesses for their hard work. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to read my open statement, which is later than open.
Always welcome.
At your back. Thank you.
Well, we'd like to welcome Charlene Frizera, former acting CMS administrator, Kirk Agrowski, former deputy chief of Department of Justice Criminal Fraud, and now at Arnold and Porter, Mark Nelson, senior vice president for risk products at Visa, as well as Lou Sicoccio, CEO of National Healthcare Anti-Fraud Association. Thank you all for your time today. You heard the previous panel, I'm sure, and so feel free to interact with things that you heard before, either that you agreed with or other points of view or you disagreed with, that I think would be helpful for us today. We've got your written testimony. It's part of the record, and now you're each recognized for 5 minutes, and then we'll follow on with the questions. So, Ms. Frizera, welcome.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank Congressman Roscoe and the committee members for inviting me today to talk a little bit about Medicaid fraud. Now, during my time at CMS, I worked there for over 30 years, and I served as the regional administrator in the Philadelphia regional office. I was the director of the Medicaid and CHIP program under Tom Scully. I was the chief operating officer under Mark McClellan, and I was eventually the acting administrator from January of 2009 until Don Berwick and Marilyn Tavener came. The reason I think that's important is over a 30-year career span at CMS, I can tell you every administration wanted to fight fraud. But, you know, as I think you'll see from my testimony today, based on my visit in Miami, You know, a lot really hasn't happened, and I think that there are many ways that particularly the fraud prevention system can be used to really do a much better job of detecting and preventing fraud. I do want to just start out by saying the people at CMS work incredibly hard every day. You know, they have very difficult jobs, and it's easy for me on the outside now to come and tell you what they should do. But as you heard today, there's so many, you know, different pressures on them, from the beneficiaries to providers to, you know, folks on the Hill, to their own internal demands, that it's very difficult to really do this job. However, I do think in the fraud prevention system there are some pretty significant changes that can be made fairly easily to make a big improvement in detecting fraud. As fraud evolves, we must realize that our systems to detect fraud and prevent fraud must change as well. Reevaluating some of the rules and processes that govern what the agency can do to detect and prevent fraud, and the technologies available today that can aid us in better detection and prevention, may provide better solutions. The goal of the fraud prevention system is to identify and prevent fraud, waste, and abuse in the Medicare fee-for-service program. The system identifies questionable billing patterns and aberrancies and provides information through an alert system report to the ZPIC contractors. The ZPICs are then tasked to follow up the investigations on particular providers. To evaluate the effectiveness of the FPS system, there should be clear accountability of the savings attributable to the FPS. The usage of the adjusted savings metric by CMS makes it very difficult to separate the results of FPS from the results that you would get from the many varied systems that were mentioned earlier today. It's difficult to assess the real returns of FPS when you don't have a control group or any other method to compare it against. Under the current system, the ZPICs get information from many sources, one of which is the FPS. In some cases, some of those leads generations are more reliable than the FPS, and of course, the ZPICs do and should follow the most reliable leads. But the overlap of effort and lack of accountability attributable to the savings make the evaluation of the effectiveness of FPS difficult and makes it hard to measure the FPS against what the ZPICs could have accomplished on their own without FPS. The impact of FPS to date has been to get more data more quickly to contractors, but the problem is it still uses today the silo-driven fee-for-service data system that's not multivariate and is limited in its design. We currently have access to greater amounts of data and technology to share that data in a much greater capacity than is used by the FPS. First, the current system is set up to detect fraud based on historical patterns. We are only able to predict fraud that copies a familiar pattern and are not able to identify new patterns of fraudulent behavior. By limiting our data sets to these variables, we miss associations that could be identified with broader data sets integrated into the system. By limiting our data sources and only using historical patterns, we may very well be allowing more effective fraud schemes over time, since we are effectively handing over our playbook to those looking to commit fraud. Second, our ability to create informational associations should be interagency, as you heard this morning, and should use a more dynamic and open network rather than a closed, fully proprietary system. Under the current contracting rules, the government owns the data and owns the intellectual property. Both of these discourage innovation. I appreciate the concerns about providing data more broadly and the concern about not owning the intellectual property. However, there exists a faulty underlying assumption in the approach that CMS has the best data and the best fraud tools available in their use. A reasonable solution would be to allow the use of information from authorized sources, those sources that CMS already entrusts with other pieces of intellectual property, states, commercial plans, contractors, and other areas of program integrity outside of the Medicare fee-for-service program, to create a more robust database that will allow for connections that are potentially being overlooked due to a lack of the unified database of information. The technology available today in the private sector has the ability to rapidly integrate a greater number of data sets and make more efficient associations between this data than is currently being used. The ability to use these more advanced systems and processes is limited by the rules and processes under which CMS is required to operate. When I was acting administrator, actually Mr. Ogroski and I were in Miami together, and I saw the inability of CMS to be able to stop billings from providers that had aberrant billings on the spot. I saw the lack of the ability to close down a physical site that was simply a storage unit because decisions had to be made, and those cases had to be referred to others to decide what to do, whether to continue to pay or not. Watching that's pretty difficult when you see just Medicaid dollars flowing out the door and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop that. Doing something the same way, expending a different answer doesn't work. Keeping the rules and the process the same will not allow for new ideas and innovation to take place. To truly stay one step ahead of fraud, we need to design a system of processes and procedures that integrate the wealth of information and data available to us today to analyze and detect fraud. This should include not just better technology, but a systemic and holistic overall and redesign of the people and processes that we use in our program integrity efforts. We should give those tasked with identifying and preventing these schemes the best information, procedural architecture, and flexibility to ensure the continued integrity of government healthcare programs and payments. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ogrowski?
Chairman, ranking member, members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for asking me to come and testify today. First thing I want to say is that fraud, by very definition, is a non-self-revealing offense. What that means is that criminals who intend to steal from Medicare fraud are trying to stay away from the system. They're not trying to be detected. They're trying to stay a step ahead of law enforcement. And like all enforcement endeavors, what I want to tell you is law enforcement depends on the victim of a crime to report a crime. So it's up to CMS to come in and say, we've been defrauded. And CMS is truly the victim here, but they're the victim representing taxpayers all across the United States. So I unfortunately have spent almost 20 years working in healthcare fraud, first as an assistant United States attorney in Miami. And I'm going to tell you a story about Ms. Fazera and I in just a moment. I've also been on the board of Lou's organization, and I've been in this business for 20 years, and I hope this subcommittee and other members of Congress can put me out of business, because I'm done. Fraud just keeps getting worse and worse, and I would prefer not to be dealing with it. So what's critical here? Timely information from CMS going to law enforcement. Information not about what's paid, after several weeks of claims processing, but what's billed by criminals. That's what's helpful to law enforcement. And no matter how many agents and prosecutors and people are assigned, having access to what's billed is really critical. And it's that timely information that makes it possible for prosecutors and agents and others in enforcement to move forward. And let me just talk about the timeliness for a second. Without timely information, that means that law enforcement is working on stale cases, old cases. Witnesses are gone. You can't use proactive techniques like a wiretap or a search warrant because the criminals are gone. Money is transferred out of bank accounts today in seconds. It's not written by checks in weeks. So effective law enforcement lives and breathes on immediate access to information. Criminals can make decisions in seconds. Government needs to be able to make decisions in seconds. If a code doesn't pay, a criminal bills something else. It's that simple. If an audit is coming, a known audit is coming, they prepare for it. And like the representative from CMS said, he's exactly right. You will never see better medical records than those prepared by criminals waiting for an audit. The medical records where we talk about things that are missing in the record, those are busy practitioners who are treating patients. The medical records that I've seen that look perfect have been in the most egregious criminal cases where people have stolen 10, 20, $100 million for providing no care. Cases where people have been billed for prosthetic limbs who had their limbs. Cases where medicine was whipped up in the back rooms of fly-by-night pharmacies where patients didn't need it and didn't get it. The case that Ms. Fazera and I worked on was fascinating because it involved the home health care services that CMS provides that should be saving taxpayer money because it should keep people out of the hospital. But what we saw in Miami was people were diagnosed falsely with conditions that they claimed to be homebound. I will tell you personally, and I worked on cases where we went to interview witnesses that were supposed to be homebound, and we couldn't find them because they were at work. And then when we did find them, they were cutting their grass. And what we found was that they not only weren't homebound, they didn't have the diseases or conditions with which they had been diagnosed. And when you take those people to trial and they have providers that are trying these cases, they say, well, everyone in our business had the same diagnosis. Everyone of the claims that we submitted got the same treatment, and we got paid. So that's a real problem that needs to be solved. So how do we solve that? And back in 2006, we had an idea in the Department of Justice. Rather than wait for the victim of the crime to respond, we were going to look at known fraud schemes in high crime areas. We were then going to take medical professionals who look at the claims and say, you know what, We don't need to pay for a prosthetic limb for someone who has their limb. We don't need to pay for home care for people that aren't homebound. Those are the types of things we sought to target, and then accessing that data coupled with the medical personnel and the law enforcement all working together. Classic community policing was very effective. Predictive analytics and modeling in today's technology is even better than it was back in 2006 and 7. The claims data points should be used by the government to stop the payment of criminal, these criminal claims. That's the only way to get this done. And one of the members of the subcommittee asked an excellent question. It relies on the coordination and cohesiveness of all of the good constituent government agencies that work on this. CMS and their contractors, OIG, DOJ, everyone at the state level at the Mafuku, they have to be on the same playbook and they have to be working off the same material. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sacuccio?
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Roscom, Ranking Member Lewis, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the National Healthcare Anti-Fraud Association, or NHCAA, on the topic of how the use of data analytics can help protect seniors and taxpayers from Medicare fraud. The United States is projected to spend $3.2 trillion on healthcare in 2015 and generate billions of claims from healthcare service providers and product providers. Medicare alone accounts for $633 billion in annual spending, representing more than 54 million beneficiaries. Additionally, our nation's healthcare system hinges upon a staggering amount of data spread across the healthcare claims adjudication systems of numerous payers. Medicare Parts A and B alone process 4.5 million claims a day. Given the complexity of the healthcare system as well as the sheer volume of activity, the challenge of preventing fraud is daunting. There are two strategies which NHCAA believes can be successful in this complex environment. The first is the application of data analytics, including predictive modeling, to healthcare data to identify potential fraud and abuse. The second is anti-fraud information sharing among all payers of healthcare, including the sharing of information between private insurers and public programs. The pay-and-chase model of combating healthcare fraud, while necessary in certain cases, is no longer tenable as the primary method of fighting this crime. Clearly, the best way to detect emerging fraud patterns and schemes in a timely manner is to aggregate claims data as much as practicable, and then to apply cutting-edge technology to the data to detect risks and emerging fraud trends. One example of the use of data analytics is CMS's fraud prevention system. Dr. Agarwal already testified with respect to that system and how it operates. It is quite understandable that many are anxious to see immediate positive results from the investments already made in adopting predictive modeling and analysis to Medicare data. NHCAA would encourage continued patience regarding the use of predictive modeling and data analysis for combating fraud. It will take time to effectively refine and adjust the models for such a large and complex system as Medicare in order to realize the full potential that these powerful tools offer. It is also important to note, however, that while the use of data analytics is a key tool in detection of fraud, it is not a panacea. Anti-fraud units responsible for ensuring the integrity of our federal health care programs must be staffed sufficiently to meet the challenge that fraud and abuse present. As we focus on the promise of technology, we mustn't overlook the vital need for adequate staffing of smart, analytical, insightful, and committed fraud-fighting professionals, both in the prevention area and also in the law enforcement area. The second key element in the fight against healthcare fraud is information sharing. Healthcare fraud does not discriminate between types of medical coverage. Healthcare providers who commit fraud bill multiple payers, both private and public. The same schemes used to defraud Medicare and Medicaid migrate to private insurance, and schemes perpetrated against private insurers make their way into government programs. It is precisely this reason why the sharing of preventive and investigative information among payers is crucial for the effective identification and prevention of healthcare fraud. Payers, whether private or public, who limit the scope of their anti-fraud information to data from their own organization or agency are taking an uncoordinated and piecemeal approach to this problem. Our experience at NHCAA as champion and facilitator of anti-fraud information exchange has taught us that it is very effective in combating healthcare fraud. NHCAA coordinated private-public anti-fraud sharing routinely helps our private side members and our government partners to safeguard and recover funds that would otherwise be lost to fraud. Another major initiative focused on data analytics and the sharing of anti-fraud information is the Healthcare Fraud Prevention Partnership, which was launched in 2012. The partnership is a joint initiative of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Justice. It is a voluntary public-private partnership between the federal government, states, health insurance plans, and health insurance associations, which aims to foster a proactive approach to detect and prevent healthcare fraud across public and private payers. NHCA believes the Healthcare Fraud Prevention Partnership is a necessary next step of information sharing. It uses the exchange of payer data, including Medicare data, to conduct targeted studies in particular fraud risk areas. In summary, harnessing the enormous quantities of data in Medicare in order to identify and predict fraud holds great promise. We support continued investment of resources to enhance and expand CMS's fraud prevention system in Medicare. Additionally, anti-fraud information data sharing among private and public payers of healthcare is critically important and should be encouraged and strengthened. Healthcare payers cannot work in isolation and expect to be successful in detecting and preventing healthcare fraud. Thank you for allowing me to speak today, and I'll certainly answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Nelson?
Chairman Roskin, Ranking Member Lewis, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Mark Nelson. I'm a Senior Vice President of Risk Products and Business Intelligence with Visa. Thank you for the invitation to appear before the subcommittee to discuss some of the ways Visa uses predictive analytics and data insights to help prevent fraud. While I am not an expert in healthcare or here to speak to the specifics of Medicare fraud, I do want to share what Visa does in payments industry to combat fraud, as our experience and perspective may be of useful insights to the subcommittee. For more than 50 years, Visa has enabled consumers, businesses, and governments to make and receive payments across the globe. Visa works behind the scenes to enable hundreds of millions of transactions each day, powered by our core processing network, VisaNet. We invest heavily in advanced fraud-fighting technologies to help make digital commerce more convenient, reliable, and secure. As a leader in security, we recognize that there is no silver bullet to protect against fraud. A layered approach that includes a combination of technology, processes, and people is required to prevent fraud, and the use of data analytics is a critical component in making this effective. Last year alone, Visa processed more than 66 billion transactions in global commerce across more than 200 countries. Since the 1990s, Visa payment volume has increased more than 1,000%, while the rate of fraud actually declined by 2/3 over the same time period. Predictive analytics are one of the core tools Visa uses to help limit fraud and make commerce more secure by identifying suspicious transactions before fraud can happen. Our use of modeling and analytics helps us keep our fraud rates low and stable at less than 0.06%, that's 6 cents for every $100 spent. Visa's analytics are among the most advanced in the payments industry. We evaluate up to 500 unique data elements to spot suspicious transactions as they occur. Visa uses a continuous feedback loop which enables our stakeholders to inform us in the event that fraud does occur. This allows us to identify patterns across the industry to help predict fraudulent behavior before a transaction is completed. Visa Advanced Authorization is the foundation of our analytics capabilities and provides an instantaneous rating of a transaction's potential for fraud. We examine such factors as account history, geolocation, transaction velocity, recent fraud, and other relevant information. This rating occurs as part of the transaction authorization process and enables financial institutions to make a more informed decision about whether to accept or decline the transaction. All of this happens today in the background for every single transaction that Visa processes in less than 1 millisecond. Visa is also beginning to provide this same type of intelligence to merchants. A recent pilot with Chevron resulted in a 23% reduction in the rate of fraudulent transactions at automated fuel pumps. This service is now live at more than 25 gas stations nationwide. This new initiative highlights the value that analytics can bring to address an area where we have seen higher propensity for fraudulent activity. Another key element of security and fraud prevention that we apply is a method called common point of purchase. We search millions of transactions to identify unique locations that show a pattern of suspicious activity. We look at historical data to build a picture of what's normal, including typical daily spend amount, the approved decline rate, average ticket size, average cross-border spend, and other data elements. We then compare that picture to what is happening now, and we look for deviations. The deviations become signals that lead to the source for a potential data compromise and allows us to further improve our analytics and prevent fraud. Criminals know we're searching for patterns, and so we are constantly working to improve our analytics. We incorporate new sources of data as they become available, such as device information, geolocation, and we are constantly working to enhance our modeling techniques to yield the best possible results. As criminal attack vectors evolve, we too follow suit and continue to improve, refine, and advance our fraud-fighting solutions through significant investment, innovation, and constant vigilance. So in closing, the reality is criminals, whether they are cyber, healthcare, or other types of fraudsters, will always exist, and their tactics will continue to evolve and try to game the system. But the good news is there are sophisticated tools available to help manage these threats. Criminals are a common foe, and each sector must work together to protect against their respective challenges. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you all for your insight. I'll turn now to Mr. Marchant on the majority side.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In listening to the first panel, it became very obvious that there was a lot of theory, a lot of concept, a lot of analytics, and probably more information than they had the ability to act on. I found that to be very discouraging. In listening to your testimony, it sounds like there is a very large gap between this panel and that you're saying that with that kind of information, if it's used properly, this problem is solvable and we can actually make some progress on this. Is that a correct analysis?
Well, I'll start. I will say I totally agree with you. And you heard the first panel. They have more data than they know what to do with. What I, in my testimony, oral and written, what I really talked about is that is true, but there is technology today that can take that data and put it together and make it more useful. The problem is, as I also mentioned, the government doesn't want contractors to keep the intellectual property of the product. And I appreciate that, because then the government gets stuck with one contractor and you can't, you're sort of beholden to them. But you have to figure out a way, how do I get new technology? How do I let people keep their intellectual property but do a better job at analyzing that data? There are folks today that have technology that can identify fraud, waste and abuse before it happens. The problem we have today is we have the claims, which are after the fact. So you need to have somebody who can actually engineer that data. So it's more, the people that we talk to that can do this are more engineers versus statisticians and researchers. You get an engineer in and let them re-engineer something. That's a very different concept than taking what we have today. And appreciate for CMS, under all the rules and restrictions they have on them, they don't really have the ability to do that. But that really is in my opinion, the answer to really trying to make this work much better in the future.
Yes, sir. I think there is more data in the system than most people could possibly know what to do with. The question is, how do you design models that are effective at rooting out fraud? My experience is that the more data points that you have, the easier it is to look for aberrations. And an aberration doesn't mean fraud. An aberration just means you need to look further. So what I mean by that is we know in the United States that you don't need a prosthetic limb if you have your legs. So you can look for a diagnosis code and then look for the product that treats it. You can match disease states with treatments. We know what the standards of care are. If you see a provider that is treating outside of the standard of care on everything, you'll know that that's a real problem. That's why years ago, DOJ, we really used nurses to look at those claims to say, these treatments don't match the diagnosis. That's a very simple way. When all of the patients from one provider do that, it tells you shouldn't be paying those claims. But it's hard to take action on that in a law enforcement context if you're not learning about it for several years. So steps have been made to the point now where the question is, can law enforcement learn of that at the time the claims start to roll in? And can they make those changes? And the more data, it's a question of how to harness that data and create those models to narrow and focus on real criminal fraud.
Well, the law enforcement piece of it is important, and getting timely information to law enforcement is certainly important. But I think the real problem is on the prevention side. Once the dollars are out the door, once you have a law enforcement involvement, you've already in some way have lost in the sense that those dollars are lost. So I think any solution really has to focus on prevention, and it has to focus in such a way that CMS could make timely, real-time decisions that says, hey, wait a minute, we're not going to pay this claim. You know, they do have suspension authority now. They do have certain things that they do from an administrative standpoint. But I think they have to be somewhat more aggressive, and there's going to be pushback from the provider community. There's no doubt about it. But you have to be more aggressive in saying, hey, there's something suspicious here. We're going to stop paying. And we're going to stop paying until we figure out whether or not there's a problem. If there's no problem, then we send the check. But right now, although there is a focus on prevention, I think to a certain degree there's still the tendency to pay that claim and then figure it out after the fact. So I think they could do a lot better job on the prevention side, and you know, they have to improve their fraud prevention system to be able to do that.
Mr. Nelson.
Trust in payments is critical to our business, and at Visa, we spend more on security than any other part of our business. And so we have architected our solutions so that we can look at all of these data points in real time. I mentioned in the statement that we create the likelihood of fraud in less than 1 millisecond. And that comes with a lot of investment, a lot of hard work. It's very hard to pull that off, but it does just require constant investment in these technologies, constant evolution of the models as fraud migrates and fraud evolves. But that's been the key to our success, is this constant innovation and use of technology as we can.
Thank you.
Mr. Lewis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank each one of you for being here, for taking the time to provide us with very important and valuable information. Mr. Socacho?
Sicoccio, yes, sir.
I don't want to mess up your name, so I won't try to pronounce it again.
Sicoccio.
Sicoccio. Well, thank you very much. I'm deeply troubled by the fraud cases that harm the recipient of Medicare. Are there other examples that you didn't list in your prepared testimony?
As far as harm to patients, yes. I mean, you know, many people, we also often talk about the dollars when we talk about healthcare fraud. But oftentimes, patients are actually physically harmed by healthcare fraud. Unnecessary services are provided. Look what happens on the pharmacy side with the misuse of prescription drugs. Many deaths occur in that arena. Every year at our annual conference, we give an award for Investigation of the Year, and several years ago, we actually gave the award for an investigation involving a pain management physician that actually, because of the treatments, the fraudulent treatments he was providing, actually killed 2 or 3 patients. And he was sentenced to life in prison under the healthcare fraud law. But there are many examples where patients are physically harmed by healthcare fraud, and I think you have to look at fraud in the Medicare system and throughout the system, not just as a financial issue, as egregious as that is, but as a patient safety issue as well.
Could you tell members of the committee whether there's a greater fraud with individual physicians, health providers, with institutions like a hospital or a clinic?
Well, that's you know, that's difficult to point out. Certainly, there are some hot areas in healthcare fraud, and again, not to denigrate any particular type of provider, but certainly home health care has been a hot area. DME has been a hot area. Community mental health, I know, has been a hot area recently, and they migrate from time to time. But it's I would say normally the vast majority of fraud, I would say, is not so much in the physician area, but in other types of healthcare providers. It's not to say there aren't physicians that are involved in healthcare fraud, but you'll often see that it's in the DME area or home health care or nursing homes, those kinds of facilities where there's it seems to be higher rates of fraud than, say, your typical physician.
And there's certain areas of the country where there's a greater degree of fraud?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the Justice Department, their strike forces is under the HEAP program, focus on certain geographic areas because of their hot areas as far as fraud. Certainly, although a lot of work has been done down in Miami and Dade County, it's still, Florida and Dade County is certainly a hot area. Southern California, certain areas in New York, Houston, Detroit. Those areas, there are certain areas where organized crime and enterprise-type criminals who enter the system strictly to commit fraud seem to focus their attention.
And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Noem?
Mr. Nelson, can you give me a percentage approximately of what you spend on fraud prevention in relation to the amount of transactions that you conduct in a year's time? I'm just wondering about cost, how much that really is, and if it's feasible for a program such as CMS to utilize.
You know, we don't disclose how much we spend on security, but like I mentioned, it is the single biggest expense of our innovation. So when we look at our global technology spend, security is our highest amount. So I can't give it an exact number, but it is extremely important to us as a business.
Did it become more feasible as you grew? I mean, I'm wondering about volume as well, having an impact on the ability to continuously invest in technology.
Yeah, it has. It's interesting. If you look over the past 30 years, our fraud rates used to be much higher, but we continuously invest in both technologies such as chip technology and encryption and data standards, but and data analytics is also a core part of that investment. So it's a combination of both data analytics and technology, but over the time period, over the 30 years, the fraud rate continues to get lower. And we're at near historic lows now, but we still strive to get even lower fraud rates. Our goal is to get it down. We're at 6 basis points today, but our goal is to get it lower. So I think that's everyone's goal, is there's always an opportunity to reduce fraud if you continue to invest in the technology.
And smaller companies, you believe, are able to utilize the same technology that you do?
They can. There's a lot of newer technology available today than there was 10 years ago. So 10, 20 years ago when Visa was developing our solutions, it was all proprietary built. But today, if you look, there are more software solutions in the marketplace that are using machine learning technologies to help implement and basically better analyze the data that you have. That's right.
How many merchants did you say use Visa or process Visa? And then do you flag these merchants for certain activities that you would deem to be worthy of watching?
So we have tens of millions of merchants that accept Visa around the world. What we do is we track both fraudulent transactions for our issuing banks. For the merchant tracking, what we typically try to do is look and see patterns of unusual behavior that helps us determine, was this merchant breached? Did a data compromise occur at that merchant? And if we have enough analysis to help prove that there is, then we would initiate what we call a forensics investigation with that merchant to help determine, did a breach really occur?
Okay. Ms. Frizera, you, in your experience, because you're so closely tied and have been with CMS, do you think the same technology that Visa is utilizing could be utilized by CMS and be affordable as well to implement and continuously upgrade and invest in the technology?
Yeah, so I'll say the question's been asked 100 times over the past 15 years that I've been involved in some of these discussions. And I think the point earlier today was it is different. You know, buying a TV is very different than a medical service. And I think the problem that CMS has is the underlying documentation that goes with the claim makes it very hard just to use the claim. So how do you take that medical documentation and make that part of a record that everyone can use? And I think to Kurt's point earlier, you know, then people just figure out a way to get around the system. So I think it's hard. They've tried a lot to really figure out how to use the system, but the underlying documentation that supports the claim has always been the problem in trying to really identify fraud outside of just numbers and volume of movement.
So you don't think there's a way to really scan the claims and use that information in a quick process that would identify it as potentially fraudulent or improper?
No, so you can scan a claim, you can put a claim in a system, and you can run claims against other claims. The claim itself is not really the fraudulent activity. The fraudulent activity is what happened under the claim, right?
There
It's
should
not
be
really-
indicators on that claim, though, shouldn't there?
Well, there are some, but again, it's not a claim by claim. It's not like, well, let me scan and look at this claim. It's taking that data together and seeing how does that fit into the pattern of other providers, and how does it fit into the pattern of that particular provider. And what we haven't been able to do today that I think we can is other information about that provider. So as people talked earlier about commercial payers, there are there's a lot of other information other than the Medicare fee-for-service claim, which is what we hang all this on. And that's part of the issue with the fraud detection. Using the Medicare fee-for-service claim has its own limitations. If you can broaden it past the claim to what other payers are seeing. So for example, if there's a provider that is excluded from a commercial payer, why doesn't Medicare automatically exclude them? Right? So that sounds like an easy question, but Medicare has its own rules. Medicare can't really say, well, I'm going to forget my rules. It's statutory, it's regulatory. They just can't say, I'm going to forget my rules and I'm just going to apply this rules. It takes time, it takes process. So a lot of it is the process that's in place that won't let them move very nimbly to make some of those changes.
I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Mr. Holding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to continue on with my line of inquiry on coordination. So, Ms. Fazera and Mr. Grosky, you've both been in the executive branch, and give me some of your thoughts about the barriers to interagency coordination in the executive branch, starting ladies first.
Well, I'll just start with our differences when we were doing this together. So there's a very big tension between a claim that or behavior that is not acceptable and the time it takes for justice to do something with the claim, right? So part of that is that gap between where do you draw the line between, okay, this is good, we're just going to stop paying the claims and we're going to get overpayments, versus saying, I don't know, this is probably really fraud and let's send it to investigators. And it's not easy. They can't do that in a short period of time. But with no criteria in between, it's very difficult to figure out where do you draw the line and saying we're just going to, it may be fraud, but it's not worth it for us to wait time for Department of Justice and OIG to do their investigations. So I think it's hard. I think the other honest answer to that is territory, right? Everybody wants credit for what happens, and it's very difficult when you don't have a system where everybody gets credit for what's happened. Everybody wants their own credit. So I think, there's a lot of that. The system does not encourage interagency cooperation. It encourages agencies to have their own metrics and their own, rewards for doing a good job.
So how do you change that?
So, I guess the way I was thinking about it, and I was just thinking about it this morning, think of an ACO for fraud, right? So all you guys are responsible for fraud. You all have to figure out how to meet X measure, and you all get rewarded, and you all get penalized if that doesn't happen. So that sounds pretty grand, but if you thought about that again, just think about it that way. Not CMS should do, DOJ should do, OIG should do, IRS should do, right? It's really that combination of how do we just they're all responsible. They have to share the responsibility, the risks, and the rewards in doing that.
There was some standard which you could hold it to, say, all right, you've got to get your fraud rate down or your mispayment rate down to under 5%, and you figure out how to do it. You think that's would be the stimulating
yes, and it would be multiple agencies responsible for that. So it's not just CMS all by itself, or OIG by itself, or DOJ by itself. Now, I will say that's easy for me to sit here and say, but, the times we've tried it before, it's hard. It's hard, but, that would be one way to think of a new way of doing it in a more coordinated penalties and rewards.
Right, Mr. Grosky.
Yeah, let me approach it this way and get into the alphabet soup just a little bit. You have max paying claims. You have ZPICs determining that the MAC payment is appropriate or not appropriate. Then you have referrals from the ZPICs that go to the OIG. Then you have the OIG coordinating with the FBI. Then you have the FBI bringing a case to DOJ. And DOJ is then going back to CMS and saying, give me the baseline data so I can determine whether a crime has been committed or not.
Right. Do you happen to know the current placement of Medicare fraud in the priorities established by the Attorney General shipped out to the U.S. attorneys?
I don't. I can tell you that what's interesting to me when I look at the DOJ reports is still almost a third of the entire criminal enforcement of healthcare fraud happens in Miami-Dade County, 2/3 in the rest of the country. And in the rest of the country, there are many districts that don't do much healthcare fraud at all. One of the things that Lou and I would disagree on is he said healthcare fraud doesn't discriminate among payers. I think, in fact, it does. It goes where the money is, and that's the trust-based system of Medicare. I think private payers have done a much better job of preventing fraud.
Do we know the fraud rate or the mispayment rate for private providers? I mean, if it's 12.7% Medicare, do we have a private provider that we can compare apples to apples with?
No, I mean, the private commercial plans, as far as an error rate, I don't think, I've never heard them keep track of it that way. Again, the distinction between fraud and erroneous payments. And fraud itself, as Dr. Argowell said, because of its nature, it's very hard to say what the percentage is. There are percentages that range from 3 to 10% of all healthcare spending in the country. That could range from anywhere from $70 billion up over $200 billion a year that's lost to fraud. And then, what do you consider fraud? What do you consider abuse? Depending on your definitions. But on the private side, I haven't seen any numbers with respect to erroneous payments as they're defined in Medicare.
So private payers have done some things that Medicare simply hasn't done, like pre-authorization for inpatient hospital admissions. I can't think of any instance in my almost 20 years of doing this where a private payer has spent billions of dollars for a drug to treat HIV that was facially unneeded. I haven't seen any incidents where private payers pay for hundreds of millions of dollars of prosthetic limbs that aren't needed. So they do a better job when claims come in. Now, of course, private payers spend a much higher percentage on admin, but you really asked about the coordination, and I think Ms. Frizera really did a service in answering that by saying the incentives within all these agencies, it needs to be collaborative and cooperative with a goal in mind of eradicating fraud. And doing that means on the front end, the victim, the trustee that administers that fund has control of that process. And that's where it starts. And law enforcement should be an afterthought in terms of, I mean, it costs money to put people in jail. It costs money to bring cases. These claims shouldn't have been paid to begin with. So that coordination needs to work across government to bring all that together.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I asked the first panel about the FPS and the zone program integrity contractors, the contractors hired to investigate fraud. I want to ask you about the relationship between the ZPICs and the Medicare administrative contractors known as MACs. My understanding is that ZPICs root out fraud and MACs review claims from providers and sign the checks. Ms. Frizera, is there any incentive for the MACs to ensure that the claims they're paying are not fraudulent?
Well, there is incentive because they want to pay good claims, but it's not their responsibility. And, just a little bit of history. So MACs used to do all of this work at some point in time, and then we re-engineered the MAC process. Legislation was passed that said we had to look at them differently, and we basically broke up the MAC so that they no longer do all of those services. So they used to do beneficiary services, they did a lot of the fraud detection, they did all of the claims processing. CMS broke that apart and divided that up so that they would specialize in fraud, waste, and abuse detection and paying claims and beneficiary contact. So they have an incentive in the sense that they obviously want to pay good claims, and some of them do have some programs where they actually do some claim review. They'll look at the claims and also notice that there's some aberrant behavior. But the ZPICs are ultimately responsible for taking that data and putting it into some tiering process and sending that to the ZPICs for processing.
Is there a way for the system to work better?
So I would offer a suggestion really would be to look at all of the Medicare contractors and what do they do and how much money they spend on what they do. And I would go back to Mr. Martin's earlier comment, RACs, ZPICs, MACs, right? There's a lot of acronyms and a lot of people trying to do fraud, waste, and abuse. We've sort of, bifurcated it, fraud, waste, abuse, and it really is all one system. You heard today the difficulty of defining the differences between the two. they really, I mean, they have different results. So fraud results in people going to jail, but all of those other activities result in abuse and waste of the system. And I think that's where there should be much more coordination in that arena, in the waste and abuse, and among and between the contractors, and maybe even, you know, some direction of how that contracting process works and who even does it.
Do the MACs use FPS's prepayment edits to stop payments before they go out?
I don't know that, do you? I don't think it does, but I don't know that for sure.
Okay. Mr. Nelson, I asked the first panel about how they evaluated the outcome of leads generated by their predictive analytics system. Does Visa have metrics to determine performance?
Yes, we create different models for different segments. So we have models for, excuse me, e-commerce fraud, for credit, for debit. And so for each model that we create, we have a performance metric that we share with our issuing banks, and they can then use that performance metric to determine what degree of false positive do they want to accept from an approve or decline perspective. So we do, every time we create a model, we have those performance projections that we just publish.
So you all do have track of false positives?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Black.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very interesting subject matter, and I'm just trying to put it all together. I actually tried to diagram all this, and I've got the FBI, the OIG, the CMS, the DOJ, the ZPEX, the MACs, the RACs. When you start looking at what the cost of operating all of these various divisions, I know that the security piece that folks like Visa use got to be expensive. I know Mr. Nelson talked about how it's a great percentage of their budget, but it seems to me that that would certainly be a savings in a long run when you look at the cost of all of these, because it's a pay and chase, and getting any of that money back is very difficult to do. So, Mr. Grodzki, I think one of the things that you said that you thought when you looked at the private sector insurance companies were the pre-authorization piece. Do you, Ms. Frazera and Mr. Grodzki, believe that that is something that we possibly should be looking at on the Medicare side, is the pre-authorizations as opposed to the pay and chase? Ms. Frazera, how about you first, and then Mr. Grodzki second?
Yeah, so I'll say every time we try to do that, physicians go crazy, so, or hospitals, whoever the provider is. So it's, you definitely delay the payment when you put a process in like that. And the complaint is you're hurting the good guys for the bad guys. So that the majority of us are doing the right thing, but we have a delayed payment because, you know, we have to allow you to prevent the bad guys. So, you know, I think there are policy issues that come out of these claims processing. So a lot of times you will see, well, this isn't right, but when you really look at what's happening, it's a bad policy. And the policy needs to be changed and adjusted to stop the waste and abuse project. I don't know that I would say that the pre-admission, the pre-authorization for hospital admission is workable in a system like CMS when you have so many beneficiaries and quite honestly, so much pressure on CMS to pay timely claims. And when providers don't get paid, that's a pretty big problem. And it becomes everybody's problem here, it becomes everybody's problem at CMS. So anything that delays that payment probably will cause a lot of problems. However, I do think there's an additional piece that CMS could do, which is really revising policies when they see things happening that are creating.
Because it is working in the private sector, and people do get paid timely in the private sector.
Yeah.
So I would like to explore that a little bit more about why that does not work in the public sector.
Yeah, so I would just add one quick comment in defense of CMS. The private payers don't have the same pressures that CMS has in paying providers publicly, right? It's a very public program. So anything that we don't do, anything that CMS would not do becomes a big public problem. Private payers really don't have that same responsibility to publicly announce that they're stopping payment. So I think the public perception is one of the issues around CMS. Makes it a little bit harder for them to do some things that maybe commercial payers.
Mr. Grodzki, you mentioned it, so let me turn to you.
So I am by no stretch of the imagination, an expert in how to run an insurance company, which is what CMS is. Private insurance companies have put in checks and balances over the years that do things like pre-admission, pre-authorization. When you have 50 million people, the bulk of whom are over 65, the rates of hospital admission are very different. That is a different thing. The administrative cost that private insurance companies run compared to the administrative cost that CMS runs is a lot different also. So there are different factors here that go into it. My thinking is Medicare has been, since the 1960s to today, a trust-based system. And that trust is earned by the majority of providers in the community. They file legitimate claims. They work hard. We're just trying, we're talking about finding ways to close those loopholes or minimize that margin, whether it's 5% or 10%, to eliminate that. And some of the ways of thinking about it are, if we can't get rid of the outright criminal fraud, then spending our time second-guessing a doctor's decision on whether someone needed to be in this status or that status seems to me to be a real waste of resources. So I don't know the right way to design it. I do know that on the other question that was asked about the structure of the system, there are a lot of components that are expensive, but everyone needs to figure out how to work together, and there are some government agencies that work great together.
I can't see how much time I have left, Mr. Chairman. Am I still?
2 seconds.
Oh, seconds. So, well, I was going to go to the historical patterns and try to figure out how do you get these historical patterns to be able to determine when there is a possibility of the fraud or the improper use of a certain procedure or a device. So to speak, someone has legs, but they get a prosthetic device.
So historical patterns, if you look at fraud cases over the last 20 years, they're replicating fraud patterns. You see, most criminals are not highly sophisticated. They copy what they see in their communities. So basic community policing knows that low barrier to entry companies, whether they're DME, home health care, some pharmacies, companies where you don't need a medical degree, you don't need a high school degree, you can go in and get a provider number. Those low barrier entry companies are the ones that tend to have patterns of repeating fraud. And if you look at the data from each community and you don't compare it to the averages across the country, but you compare it to the mean for Medicare beneficiaries, you can very quickly see DME, ambulance, home health, these things just pop off a page and they're repetitive. And as much as we would try at DOJ to tackle and reduce those rates, and we were able to see it in the claims data, as soon as the DME would drop, the home health would go up. So the criminals are on the move.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me just ask a few closing questions, and I'll sort of gallop through these kind of quickly, but they're important, I think, for the record and to bring this discussion to fruition. Mr. Nelson, there's been a lot of discussion about paying and the delay of payments and so forth. How does Visa mitigate, you got an unhappy merchant who's not going to be, who's part of your system and you want to keep satisfied, but how do you all mitigate that relationship if the argument is, hey, look, you got an unhappy provider here and so forth? Can you walk us through that parallel? Just give us some insight.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's a little bit different for Visa because our relationship is with the acquiring bank. So each merchant has an acquiring bank. And so we go after the acquiring bank if there is a fraud case, for example. And so it's up to the acquiring bank to actually go to each individual merchant to collect the funds. So from our perspective, it's a little bit easier in terms of how we manage and monitor the system.
How long does that process usually take?
It depends. It depends kind of by geography. It can be fairly quick, a couple of days. It could be a couple of weeks as well.
Are you able to discern between a fraudulent claim, a false claim, and an error?
That's a little bit more on the issuing side. Sometimes the issuers have since we have zero liability, some consumers will take advantage of that and they'll claim it's fraud, but it may actually be the genuine consumer. So the issuing banks deal with that to some degree. We call it first-party fraud. And they will have to do some due diligence to say, did this person really do this or not? And that's going to be up to each individual bank to determine, was it really fraud or not? But the banks will use our tools to help assess that. So if it's within pattern and the risk scores are low, the bank can use that to help determine, hey, this is actually maybe the genuine consumer.
So a question for Mr. Nelson and Mr. Ogroski. Can you help us discern this kind of this concept that's been floating out there today? The CMS asserted earlier, hey, there's all these other data points, and that makes our life more complicated. Isn't there an argument that says, no, if you have more data points, it's actually more helpful? Who's right? What's up with that?
So I'll answer it from my perspective, looking at the data and analyzing claims data. And I like claims data. I don't need an electronic health record to be able to spot patterns and trends. Basic data points on a healthcare claim, you can't look at just one claim standing alone. You look at the providers in a community, and you look at all of their claims. And what I see in claims forms are really some basic things that are very helpful. Does the diagnosis match the service? Is the doctor alive? Is
Crazy,
the zip
that. Wow.
is the zip code within the same region as the provider? Like, is the patient's home address near the provider?
Now, just for my benefit, is that billing information? So walk me through. You got an underlying medical record, right? That's not what you're really talking about.
No, I'm talking
You're talking about
a
claims.
1500 form. It used to be the HCFA 1500 form.
And that's all you've got to look at. That's what you're saying?
That's what I've always used, is you have the name of the beneficiary, you have their Medicare number, which is the Social Security number, you have their home address where they live, you have the name of the provider, you have the doctor or the ordering physician, and you have the service or the item. So you have all of this information. Now, if I wanted to know, and I've seen cases where the provider is let's say in Miami, and is servicing patients from all over the country. Well, how would that be possible? Well, it's theoretically possible. They could have all traveled to Miami. But then you look at the next thing. Does the diagnosis match the treatment? And then I would consult with a nurse and say, gee, they've ordered all braces for people diagnosed with arthritis. Do you brace an arthritic joint? And the nurse would say, no, you don't brace an arthritic joint. You flex an arthritic joint. So there's enough information for me to be able to look at that claim form and flag it as an aberrational claim form. Now, once it's flagged as an aberrational claim form, it doesn't mean that the provider's committed fraud. There could be a specialist out there that has a unique treatment. But then what you do is you refer it, and the ZPIC or someone goes out to see, does this company actually exist? And what I would find when we would send people out from OIG or from some of these agencies, they would show up at the provider, and it wouldn't exist.
So can I put you in the Peter Roscom camp of more data is better?
I think so. I think that there are many choices.
It's perfect. That's right where I want you. Mr. Nelson, what do you think?
Oh, I would agree. More data is generally better. I think one of the challenges, though, is organizationally, a lot of times data is siloed within different databases. So in order to really use it, you have to develop and engineer the systems that can get access to the data in real time to either build the models or analyze the activity. But if you can use the data, then it's valuable.
Okay, so the just last little line of inquiry. Ms. Frazera, do you think should CMS be able to discern between improper payments and fraud? You heard me. I was surprised.
Yeah. Well, I'll say they should. And I think the distinction really is they can distinguish it, but people continue to put it in the same bucket, right? So everybody calls it fraud. It really isn't. I mean, you can redefine fraud differently. Fraud is defined as people illegally using the system. And fraud, in the way it's been interpreted and used, are the really bad guys just really scamming the system. Improper payments, maybe not. Maybe they're just scamming the system a little bit, right? It's just improper. So I think it's the definition that makes that very hard. And when people talk about fraud, they include all of that, and it's not the same. Fraud is really, when you have the strike teams and you see the data about real fraud, they put people in jail. That's fraud. That's very different than the waste and abuse, and improper payments are in that bucket. So I think the difficulty is people tend to put it all into one bucket, but I think if you define fraud as people who go to jail, they can give you those differences. I think the definition is just very unclear today when you ask the question.
So let me just wrap up. I know I speak on behalf of the ranking member and every member here. It's been really helpful for us to get your perspective. Your time is valuable, and you've been generous with your time today, and we really, really appreciate it. one point, and that is on the general concern about slowing down of payments, and there's clearly a sensitivity to that. But if you look at the reality and kind of the broader picture, we have a sword of Damocles over our head, and the sword of Damocles is an SGR that will come to an end, which, what does that mean? That means a 22% payment cut for providers, which is unpleasant and miserable. That's not slow, that's never coming. Now, you know and I know it's going to get fixed, but I think we need to think more broadly in the totality of there's plenty of money for us to deal with this system. There's plenty of money to make sure that seniors are cared for, and to Mr. Lewis's point, that nobody is left on the side here. But we absolutely need to be much, much smarter about how we do this. And I know that this subcommittee and the members who are on it on a bipartisan basis are passionate about this. Make one other point. A lot of times we conflate, and this is a point that you made, Ms. Frizera, we conflate these concepts of waste, fraud, and abuse, and they become almost a phrase that we chuck out. And I think of them to be, the more I've thought about this responsibility that I have now, I begin to think of them in different ways. Abuse is what we heard last month at this committee. We had the IRS had been abusing people with civil forfeiture. That's the misuse of government power, poorly placed in someone that's used to a bad end. That is civil forfeiture that was abusive. Fraud is that hustler, that manipulator, somebody that comes and gains a personal gain, a pecuniary gain, but it's ill-gotten. And a waste is something different. Waste is ordering the pencils and paying too much for them, or leaving the lights on, or being stupid and gratuitous while it's easy to spend other people's money. And that sort of construct has been helpful for me and to think about the responsibility of this subcommittee. But here's what I know. I know that we've got to do better. I know that on a bipartisan basis, with the help of all of the members of this subcommittee, we will do better. And your insight today, all four of you, was very, very helpful. And I know I speak for every member in thanking you. Thank you. This is adjourned.